The crystal water goblets caught the low light of the dining room chandelier when my father raised his scotch and handed my grandfather's company over to my brother. "Carter just has the grit for the factory floor," my father announced to the table, looking right past me. My mother patted my arm and told me to be supportive, adding that my little finance job in Chicago was not real work anyway. 12 faces waited for me to react, to argue, or to fold the way they expected a daughter to fold. I just took a sip of my wine. What none of them knew was that the ink was already dry on a Delaware holding company deed sitting in my briefcase by the door, making me the senior secured creditor of their entire bankrupt operation. And in about 14 days, the golden boy they thought had grit was going to pass out cold on a boardroom floor. Welcome to Morning Revenge, where quiet women let the paperwork do the talking and out-of-touch rooms go dead silent. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. My name is Audrey Elizabeth, and I buy distressed corporate assets for a living. To explain how I ended up sitting at the head of a restructuring table watching my family lose their minds, I have to take you back to that Friday night dinner at the Elizabeth Estate in Grand Rapids, Michigan. In our part of the Rust Belt, manufacturing is not just a business, it is a bloodline. The culture here is built on heavy steel, generations of grease, and a stubborn belief that only sons possess the physical endurance to run the factories. I am 32 years old and a managing director in private equity. I spend my weeks flying between Chicago and New York, tearing down obsolete corporate structures and restructuring 9-figure debt portfolios. But in my parents' house, my career was treated like a typing class. My father, Richard, stood at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing his customary tweed jacket. He held his glass high, the ice clinking sharply against the sides. "We have weathered 3 recessions, 2 union strikes, and the shift to offshore supply chains," he said, his voice echoing off the dark wood wainscoting. "Elizabeth Machining is still standing because we understand steel." I traced my thumb over the rim of my wine glass. I kept my face perfectly still, a skill I learned sitting across from hostile boards. I knew exactly why Elizabeth Machining was still standing. It was standing because a regional bank had granted them a 3rd extension on a commercial loan they had 0 capacity to repay. Richard shifted his gaze toward the man slouched in the chair to his right, my brother Carter. Carter is 34, wearing a pristine golf polo, scrolling through a screen hidden just below the table line. "It is time for the next generation to take the helm," my father declared. "Carter, effective Monday, you will assume the title of Chief Executive Officer." Silence stretched across the dining room. Carter looked up, slipped his phone into his pocket, and offered a practiced, easy grin. He raised his own glass. This was the same brother who had launched a boutique fitness application that folded in 6 months, followed by a craft brewery that ended in a quiet, out-of-court settlement with its suppliers. My father had written the checks to bury both failures. Across from me, my mother Catherine leaned forward. Her pearls clicked softly against the edge of the table. She leveled a pointed look at me, her tone laced with that specific, honeyed instruction designed to keep a daughter in her place. "Audrey, darling," she said, her smile tight, "we expect you to step back and be supportive. Your brother has the practical mindset for the factory floor. We need everyone rowing in the same direction. Spreadsheets are fine for a hobby, but this is a legacy." I looked at my mother. The scent of the roast beef and the rich, dusty finish of the Bordeaux wine suddenly felt suffocating. They were telling a 32-year-old financial executive to step aside for a man who did not know how to read a basic profit and loss statement. They expected me to nod to accept that my elite education and grueling 80-hour work weeks were nothing but unreal paper pushing compared to Carter's unearned biology. I did not grip the edge of the table. I did not raise my voice. I let my shoulders relax. I let them see the obedient daughter they wanted to see. "Of course, Mother," I replied. My voice was level and smooth. "I am always supportive of the family legacy." Carter winked at me. a gesture of hollow triumph. He thought he had won. He thought he was inheriting a crown. I looked at his smug face and felt a deep, cold calm settle into my ribs. I let him enjoy his scotch. I let my father enjoy his speech. They wanted to play industrial titans, and I was going to let them. I knew something they did not. Elizabeth Machining was currently bleeding cash, drowning in $8 million of toxic defaulted debt. My father thought a firm handshake and his family name would keep the bank at bay. He had no idea that private equity firms do not care about handshakes. I raised my glass toward my brother, offering a warm smile that did not reach my eyes. I was not going to warm them. I was going to let Carter drive my father's precious legacy directly into a brick wall, and I was going to be the one waiting at the crash site holding the deed. Monday arrived with the predictable weight of unearned authority. Carter did not spend his first morning walking the production floor. He did not review the precarious accounts payable or shake hands with the second shift foreman. His inaugural act as chief executive officer was driving a leased, pristine pearl-white Range Rover into the reserved parking space outside the main facility. He charged the lease directly to the corporate account, coding it under executive travel expenses. I monitored this transaction from my office in downtown Detroit, 60 stories above the gray currents of the river. My workspace was silent, defined by clean lines of glass and steel, a sharp contrast to the grinding, oil-soaked reality of the factory my grandfather built. I spent my morning dismantling a failing logistics firm, slicing apart their assets with clinical precision. Meanwhile, my brother spent his afternoon updating his professional networking profiles. I watched his new post go live. It featured a professionally staged photograph of him standing in front of the foundry, wearing a hard hat that lacked a single scratch. The caption read, "Humbled to take the reins of the family empire, ready to disrupt the local industry." In West Michigan, manufacturing is a religion of fractions. The culture operates on margins thinner than paper, measured in thousandths of an inch and fractions of a cent. You do not survive by disrupting. You survive by understanding the exact degradation rate of a tungsten carbide drill bit. You survive by knowing the precise temperature the coolant needs to maintain to keep the steel from warping. My father and grandfather knew the sound a dying motor made before it seized. Carter only knew the sound of his own voice echoing in the executive suite. By Thursday afternoon, the illusion of his leadership began to fracture. My private line blinked, displaying a Grand Rapids area code. It was Thomas. Thomas had managed the production floor since I was in middle school. He was a man with permanent grease embedded in the creases of his knuckles, a pragmatist who possessed a mind like a steel trap. "Audrey, I hate to bother you at your real job," Thomas said. His voice carried the tight, constrained static of a man trying very hard to remain professional while his blood pressure spiked. "But your brother is going to get someone hurt on the line, or he is going to bankrupt us before the weekend." I set my pen down. I turned away from my monitors and looked out at the Detroit skyline. "Tell me what he did, Thomas." "He walked in here at 11 o'clock and demanded a 30% increase in the automotive die casting output by the end of the month." Tomas explained, the exhaustion heavy in his throat. I told him our current cooling systems cannot handle that cycle rate without a scheduled maintenance overhaul. We need downtime to recalibrate. He told me to stop making excuses and run the machines hot. "Audrey, the casting molds will warp under that thermal stress. We will end up producing a batch of scrap metal worth $250,000, and we will lose the aerospace contract when it fails inspection." I closed my eyes. I could almost smell the burning coolant, the sharp tang of ozone, and the metallic dust of the factory floor. When I was a child, I used to walk that floor with a clipboard, asking Thomas how the hydraulics worked. My father always steered me back toward the reception desk, insisting the heavy machinery was no place for a girl. Now, the boy he deemed worthy was actively destroying the hardware. I felt a sharp pinch of sympathy for Thomas. He was a loyal, brilliant soldier, serving a general who did not know which end of the rifle to point. "What did he say when you showed him the maintenance budget deficit?" I asked softly. "He told me we need to be lean and agile," Thomas scoffed. Then he left for a 3-hour lunch at the Makatawa Country Club. He said he had to entertain prospective clients. I thanked Thomas for his loyalty, promising him I would look into the situation. I did not, however, promise to fix it. When I ended the call, I turned my attention back to my dual monitors. I pulled the public financial filings, the credit reports, and the raw ledger data from the shared family trust drives. It took me less than 45 minutes to map the true decaying anatomy of Elizabeth Machining. The numbers painted a portrait of slow, agonizing starvation. The cash flow statements were a sea of red ink. Accounts receivable were stretching past 90 days, while furious suppliers were demanding payment at 30. But the real poison lurked in the debt structure. 3 years ago, my father had taken out an $8 million commercial loan to purchase automated milling centers, gambling on a defense contract that never materialized. They were servicing the interest, just barely keeping the lights on, but the principal remained a monolithic weight. Their debt service coverage ratio was toxic. The company checking account drifted dangerously close to overdrawing every other week just to meet the Friday payroll. Carter was dining on Wagyu beef and charging premium scotch at the country club, performing the role of a titan, while the ground beneath him crumbled into dust. The old Audrey, the daughter, who still harbored a quiet, pathetic hope for her father's validation, would have drafted a rescue plan. I would have canceled my weekend, driven across the state, slapped the spreadsheets down on his mahogany desk, and begged him to listen to reason. I would have shielded them from the consequences of their own vanity, but the woman sitting in the high-rise did not move an inch. I remembered the smug wink my brother offered at the dinner table. I remembered my mother telling me my grueling 80-hour work weeks were merely a hobby compared to real work. They wanted the crown. I decided they needed to learn exactly how heavy that crown was. I opened a new encrypted folder on my secure server. I typed 2 words into the title field: Project Rust. I began downloading the loan covenants, the asset appraisals, and the vendor contracts, organizing them by vulnerability. I was no longer looking at my family's sacred legacy. I was looking at a distressed asset. I evaluated it with the same cold, clinical precision I applied to a failing tech startup. The operational structure was weak, the executive leadership was blind, and the underlying collateral was highly valuable if separated from the incompetent management. To rebuild a rotting house, you cannot simply paint over the mold. You have to let the foundation crack open. You have to let the walls collapse so you can clear away the debris and pour new concrete. Carter was the wrecking ball, and I was going to let him swing until nothing was left standing. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, watching the blinking cursor on my terminal, waiting for the inevitable domino to tip. It did not take long. The following Tuesday afternoon, a quiet, automated alert pinged across my financial monitoring wire. The regional bank holding the $8 million commercial note flagged Elizabeth Machining. Carter, in a stroke of breathtaking financial illiteracy, had diverted the funds meant for the monthly loan payment to cover his new luxury vehicle lease and an ill-advised flashy marketing retainer. They had officially missed a critical debt covenant. The ticking clock had started. The grace period was evaporating, and the bank was about to knock on the front door. The financial markets possess a cold, undeniable rhythm. They do not care about a century-old legacy, your generational pride, or how many union strikes your grandfather broke in the 1980s. The amber text scrolling across my Bloomberg terminal on Thursday morning told a story without a single shred of empathy. Elizabeth Machining had breached its primary lending covenant. The regional bank holding the $8 million commercial note shifted the account status from standard monitoring to distressed. I sat in the quiet chill of my office, a cup of black espresso warming my palm, watching the digital marker update in real time. In the world of private equity, this status change was blood in the water. To the algorithms scanning the debt markets, my family's sacred crown was now just a decaying carcass waiting for the scavengers. The liquidity ratio had plunged into the red zone. The trigger had been pulled. 200 miles away, behind the heavy oak doors of the executive suite, panic was undoubtedly setting in. I pictured Carter pacing the length of the Persian rug, the smug country club confidence melting off him like cheap wax. I could see the sweat gathering at his temples as he tried to explain the missing funds. He would blame the economy, the supply chain, the rising cost of raw materials. He would point his finger at anyone, but the man looking back at him in the mirror. And my father, Richard Elizabeth, would be sitting behind his desk, his jaw set in a rigid line of denial. The psychology of the Rust Belt patriarch is a fascinating, tragic study in stubbornness. Men like my father built their empires in an era when a firm handshake and a round of golf with the local branch manager could smooth over a late payment. They believed in the physical weight of things: steel, iron, sweat. To Richard, a bank was a building downtown where men he knew by their first names held his money in a vault. He did not understand that his local lender had been acquired 3 years ago by a faceless national conglomerate. He did not realize that the loan officer he used to drink scotch with had been replaced by a risk assessment algorithm running on a server in New Jersey. That algorithm did not care that he sponsored the local Little League team. It only cared about the missing principal payment. Instead of calling a restructuring specialist, instead of hiring an outside auditor to untangle the mess Carter made, my father would double down. Admitting he needed professional help meant admitting his son was a catastrophic failure. Acknowledging Carter was a failure meant confronting his own biological prejudice as a fatal flaw. Richard would rather steer the entire company into the abyss than let a stranger look at his ledger and tell him he picked the wrong heir. I set the espresso cup down on a coaster. The ceramic clinked softly against the wood. I spent the next 2 hours mapping the exact legal parameters of the defaulted loan. The covenants were standard, brutal, and highly restrictive. The bank now possessed the legal right to accelerate the debt, demanding the full $8 million immediately. If the company failed to produce the cash, the bank could place a lien on the factory equipment, freeze the operating accounts, and force a liquidation sale. The noose was tightening, and the men in charge were too busy adjusting their ties to notice the rope. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my personal cell phone illuminated. The caller ID displayed my parents' landline. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hello, Mother." "Audrey, darling," Catherine said. Her voice lacked its usual polished cadence. It was hushed, rushed, and trembling slightly at the edges. I could hear the faint hum of the estate's wine cellar compressor in the background. She was hiding in the basement. "Are you well?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "Oh, everything is fine." "Just fine," she stammered, though her ragged breathing betrayed the lie. "We were wondering if you might be able to come home this weekend. Tomorrow, if possible. Your father and I need a favor. Just a small family favor." A small family favor. The phrase hung in the digital space between us. For 32 years, I had been the recipient of their demands. Be quiet, be supportive, be invisible. Now they were asking for a favor. I knew exactly what they wanted. They did not want my strategic mind or my restructuring expertise. They wanted my checkbook. They wanted me to open my personal portfolio and act as a human shield for Carter's incompetence. They assumed I would blindly hand over my hard-earned capital to protect the illusion of their perfect family. "I am quite busy this weekend, Mother," I replied, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her sweat. "Please, Audrey, it is urgent. Your father is very stressed. It concerns a minor cash flow hiccup at the business. We are family, Audrey. Family takes care of each other." The desperation in her voice was a tangible thing clinging to the receiver. The minor tremor of financial distress was merely the overture. The true betrayal, the insulting demand I knew they were preparing to make, was about to be laid bare. I closed the window on my terminal, watching the distressed debt index disappear into the black screen. "I will be there tomorrow morning at 10, I said, and ended the call before she could offer a hollow thank you. I stood up from my desk and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling grid of Detroit. The city below was a testament to survival, to reinvention after collapse. I was about to enact a collapse of my own. I left the office early and drove to my penthouse overlooking the river. I bypassed the casual weekend wear in my walk-in closet. This was not a family visit. This was a hostile negotiation. I reached for the armor I reserved for closing 9-figure deals with ruthless hedge fund managers. I selected a bespoke charcoal gray suit tailored to a razor-sharp fit. The wool blend was stiff, unforgiving, and projected pure authority. I chose a crisp white silk blouse and a pair of black stilettos that echoed on the hardwood floor like a gavel striking a block. As I packed a sleek leather overnight bag, I felt a fundamental shift occurring in my chest. The obedient daughter who sought approval at the dinner table was dead. She had been dying for years, suffocated by the endless casual misogyny of a father who looked right past her and a mother who demanded her complicity. In her place, an apex predator awoke. I zipped the garment bag with a swift, definitive motion. My family believed they were summoning a subordinate. They thought they were calling in a loan from a subservient child who would gladly drain her own accounts to keep her brother in a luxury vehicle. They were about to learn that when you summon a shark to a bleeding ship, you do not get a lifeguard. I set the alarm, locked the penthouse door, and took the elevator down to the garage. The drive to Grand Rapids would take a little over 2 hours. 2 hours to clear my mind, sharpen my teeth, and prepare for the insult I knew was waiting in my father's study. The trap was set. The bait was bleeding, and I was holding the only net. The gravel driveway of the Elizabeth estate crunched beneath the heavy tires of my hired town car, a rhythmic, grounding sound that cut through the cool Michigan morning air. I instructed my driver to wait by the front portico. I did not plan on staying long. The house was a sprawling Tudor monument built in the 1970s, a towering structure of dark brick and climbing ivy, funded by decades of profitable defense contracts and automotive supply chains. It was a physical manifestation of my father's ego, designed to project permanence. As I walked up the slate steps, the sheer weight of the architecture felt less like a fortress and more like a mausoleum. The housekeeper opened the heavy oak door before I could knock, her eyes darting downward in a silent, nervous greeting. She directed me toward the back study. The air inside the house felt suffocating thick, with the scent of lemon furniture polish, stale cigar smoke, and an undeniable undercurrent of panic. I pushed open the double doors to my father's study. The room was a shrine to old industry. Framed blueprints of early milling machines lined the walls, and a large brass grandfather clock ticked in the corner, marking the seconds they no longer had. My father, Richard, sat behind his imposing mahogany desk. His face was drawn the usual ruddy color of his cheeks, replaced by a sallow, grayish pallor. My mother, Catherine, stood by the tall windows, wringing her hands together so tightly her knuckles were white. And then there was Carter. My brother lounged sideways on a plush leather Chesterfield sofa, one leg draped over the armrest, tossing a wooden golf tee into the air and catching it. He did not look like a man whose company was days away from a fatal margin call. He looked like a teenager waiting for his parents to talk him out of a detention. "Audrey, you made good time," my father said, forcing a hollow, synthetic warmth into his voice. "Have a seat. Let us discuss business." I bypassed the soft leather guest chairs designed to make visitors sink and feel small. Instead, I stood by the fireplace, keeping my posture straight, my bespoke charcoal suit acting as a tailored suit of armor. "I prefer to stand," I replied, folding my hands together. "Mother said this was an urgent family matter." My father cleared his throat, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. He refused to look me in the eye, choosing instead to focus on a silver letter opener resting on his blotter. "We are navigating a minor liquidity squeeze," he began, utilizing terminology he clearly did not understand. "A temporary cash flow bottleneck. Carter has secured several promising leads, very lucrative contracts, but the supply chain delays have caused a slight gap in our operating capital." I watched the vein pulse in his neck. He was lying. There were no new contracts. There was only a neglected ledger, a terrified floor manager, and an $8 million loan the bank was about to call in. "We need to smooth out the transition period," my mother chimed in, taking a step toward me. Her voice was shrill, lacking its usual polished country club cadence. "We are a family, Audrey. When the family legacy needs a bridge, we all pitch in. That is what your grandfather would have done." I kept my face perfectly still. "And what exactly does this bridge look like?" I asked. My father finally looked up, his jaw tightening. "We need a short-term capital injection, $1.5 million. You have extensive portfolios, Audrey. We know how well you are compensated in Chicago. We need you to draw a personal loan against your holdings and transfer the funds to the corporate operating account by Monday morning." The sheer entitlement of the request hung in the stale air. They were asking for $1.5 million of my personal wealth, money I had earned through grueling 80-hour weeks, missing holidays, and sacrificing sleep for a decade. They wanted it transferred directly into the hands of a brother who could not balance a checkbook, all to preserve the illusion that he was a capable leader. "What are the terms?" I asked, keeping my tone surgical and detached. "What is the interest rate? What collateral are you offering to secure my capital?" Carter stopped tossing the golf tee. He let out a loud, mocking scoff, sitting up on the sofa. "Listen to her," he sneered, shaking his head. "She sounds like a debt collector. This is family, Audrey. You do not ask for a repayment schedule from your own blood." My father slammed his hand flat against the mahogany desk, making the brass lamp rattle. "Your brother is right," Richard barked, the synthetic warmth vanishing entirely. "You march in here demanding terms like some Wall Street vulture. We are talking about Elizabeth Machining. We make real things here, Audrey, tangible assets, steel, iron. We employ hundreds of men who rely on us. You sit in a glass tower shuffling funny money around, moving imaginary digits on a screen. Your wealth is paper. Our wealth is real. I am telling you to use your funny money to protect the real work we do." I looked at the man who raised me. He was trapped in a delusion, clutching a sinking anchor and demanding I drown with him just to prove my loyalty. He truly believed my career, my intellect, and my capital were worthless unless they were serving his outdated patriarchal fantasy. "I will not fund this," I said. My voice was quiet, lacking any trace of anger or hesitation. The grandfather clock ticked 3 times before my mother gasped. "Audrey Elizabeth, how dare you?" she hissed, closing the distance between us. "It is a matter of fiduciary negligence," I explained, maintaining eye contact with my father. "Elizabeth Machining is carrying $8 million in defaulted debt. $1.5 million will not cure the default. It will only cover payroll and Carter's executive expenses for a few more weeks before the bank seizes the assets anyway. Throwing my clean capital into a burning building managed by an arsonist is an unacceptable risk. The answer is no." The room detonated. The polite veneer shattered, exposing the toxic rot underneath. "You selfish, bitter girl," my mother shrieked, her face twisting into a mask of pure venom. "You have always been jealous of your brother. You sit in that empty penthouse in Detroit with your tailored suits and your cold heart, hoarding your money because you cannot keep a man. You are a spinster, Audrey. You are trying to sabotage Carter because he is carrying on the family name, something you will never do. You want to see him fail just to make yourself feel important." I absorbed the words. I did not flinch. I did not cry. And I did not raise my voice to defend my life. I memorized the shape of her mouth as she tried to wound me. I felt my pulse steadying, slowing down to a calm, rhythmic beat. The last invisible thread of familial obligation, the quiet hope that they might one day see my value, snapped. The severance was clean and painless. My father stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest. "If you walk out that door, you are finished in this house," he roared, his voice cracking with desperation and fury. "Do you hear me? Not a single dime of this estate will ever go to you. I will call my attorneys on Monday and write you out of the will entirely. You will be erased from this legacy." I looked at his trembling finger. I looked at Carter, who was now staring at the floor, letting his parents fight his battles, too cowardly to even ask for the money himself. I looked at the framed blueprints on the walls, realizing they were pictures of a ghost ship. "Keep your will, Richard," I said softly. "There will be nothing left to inherit anyway." I turned on my heel and walked out of the study. I did not slam the heavy oak doors. I closed them with a soft, definitive click, sealing them inside their own sinking tomb. I walked through the grand foyer, past the nervous housekeeper, and stepped out into the crisp, unfiltered sunlight. The air tasted cleaner. My driver opened the rear door of the town car. I slid into the leather seat, the quiet hum of the engine isolating me from the imposing brick house. I opened my briefcase, took out my secure cellular phone, and dialed a New York area code. The line connected after 2 rings. "Evelyn," I said, staring out the tinted window as the car rolled down the gravel driveway. "I am here, Audrey," my corporate attorney replied, her voice crisp and alert. "How was the family reunion?" "Enlightening," I answered. "They are entirely uncooperative and living in a state of terminal denial. The patient cannot be saved by conventional means." "Understood," Evelyn said, the sound of a keyboard clacking in the background. "What are your instructions?" I watched the iron gates of the Elizabeth estate fade into the distance. It was time to stop playing the obedient daughter. It was time to let the predator off the leash. "Initiate the final phase of Project Rust," I instructed, my voice hard and cold as Michigan steel. "Contact the regional bank immediately. Ironclad Holdings is formally offering to purchase the entire $8 million distressed debt portfolio of Elizabeth Machining. Pay whatever premium they ask to expedite the transfer. I want to own the paper by Monday morning." And Evelyn, "Yes, Audrey. Once the transfer is complete, prepare the formal notice of default. Do not use my name on any of the initial correspondence. Let them think a faceless New York firm is coming for them." "Consider it done," Evelyn said. I ended the call and rested my head against the cool leather seat. My father thought my money was funny. He thought my career was a paper-pushing hobby. In a few short days, he was going to learn that paper cuts deeper than iron, and the daughter he tried to erase was the only person holding the pen. The architecture of corporate vengeance is rarely built with steel or poured concrete. It is constructed with wire transfers, encrypted server logs, and impenetrable non-disclosure agreements. By Tuesday morning, Ironclad Holdings, LLC, was no longer just a digital ghost living on a Delaware registry. It was a fully capitalized predator, armed and waiting in the shadows. My father always claimed that true power was forged in furnaces. He measured success by the tonnage of raw iron shipped from his loading docks, dismissing my career as a harmless exercise in shuffling imaginary numbers. He failed to realize that the modern world is ruled by the people who own the paper those loading docks are built on. I sat in the hushed, climate-controlled environment of my Detroit office, watching my corporate attorney Evelyn projected on the large, high-definition monitor. Evelyn operated out of a glass tower in Manhattan. She was a master of legal extraction, possessing a mind sharper than a scalpel and a demeanor as warm as dry ice. "We are clear to proceed," Evelyn stated, her eyes scanning a document just out of frame. "The regional bank is highly motivated to offload this liability. They are offering the commercial note at 60 cents on the dollar. To their risk assessment algorithms, Elizabeth Machining is a toxic asset, ruining their quarterly performance metrics. They want the bad debt off their books before the fiscal quarter closes on Friday. Execute the purchase, I replied, my voice steady. Use the capital reserves from the secondary holding account. I want the transfer finalized and recorded before the end of the business day. In the realm of private equity, whoever holds the debt holds the leash. By purchasing the note, Ironclad Holdings acquired every right, covenant, and penalty clause originally negotiated by the bank. I was no longer the discarded daughter, told to sit quietly while the men talked business. I was the senior, secured creditor of my father's entire empire. I owned the mortgage on the factory. I owned the liens on the heavy machinery. If the company liquidated tomorrow, I would be paid before the vendors, before the union pensions, and long before Richard Elizabeth saw a single dime of equity. I had quietly purchased the ground beneath their feet. 200 miles away, my brother remained blissfully unaware of the tectonic shift occurring beneath his expensive leather shoes. I maintained access to the corporate ledger through a read-only back door I had installed years ago to monitor my parents' reckless spending. I watched Carter's digital footprint in real time. He was busy playing the conquering hero, performing the role of an industrial titan for an audience of sycophants. The ledger showed a charge of $3,000 at a high-end Grand Rapids steakhouse. Carter had booked a private dining room to celebrate a new contract with a secondary automotive parts distributor. I pulled the parameters of the contract from the shared server. It was a staggering display of financial illiteracy. Carter had underbid the project so severely that the factory would lose $1.50 on every unit produced just to keep the assembly lines running. He was cannibalizing his own profit margins to secure a minor, worthless victory. Yet he ordered vintage champagne. He toasted his own brilliance, charging the opulent dinner to an operating account that was currently drawing on a high-interest overdraft line. He was celebrating a leak in the hull of a sinking ship, convinced he was walking on water. I spent my evenings in my penthouse, bathed in the cool blue light of my dual monitors, weaving an impenetrable web of legal obfuscation. I knew my father. The moment he felt cornered, he would hire aggressive local attorneys to hunt down the entity squeezing his throat. I needed to ensure they found nothing but ghosts. I instructed Evelyn to layer the ownership of Ironclad Holdings through a labyrinth of corporate shielding. We established a secondary shell corporation in Wyoming, known for its strict privacy laws, and routed the primary control through a blind trust administered in the Cayman Islands. If my father sent his lawyers to trace the new creditor, they would hit a solid brick wall of generic registered agents and automated answering services. He would never see my face behind the corporate veil until I chose to lift it. With the camouflage in place, I began designing the trap. The original loan documents I purchased included a standard acceleration clause. Because Carter had already missed a critical payment and violated multiple debt service ratios, Ironclad Holdings possessed the legal authority to demand the entire $8 million principal balance immediately. I instructed Evelyn to set a strict 30-day window for compliance. If they failed to produce the millions they owed, Ironclad would legally seize the real estate, the intellectual property, and every piece of equipment on the factory floor. I wanted the legal documentation wrapped in layers of suffocating, archaic corporate jargon. The goal was not just to demand payment, but to disorient and terrify the reader. I wanted the words to read like a death sentence, delivered in a language my brother could not decipher. It was late Thursday evening when Evelyn and I held our final review. The city of Detroit glittered outside my window, a sprawling grid of amber lights and quiet ambition. Evelyn looked into the camera, holding up a thick stack of printed paper. "The notice of default is finalized," Audrey Evelyn said. "It is 47 pages of relentless contractual enforcement. It demands the immediate cure of all outstanding defaults or the total surrender of all corporate assets. We have stripped away every grace period and eliminated every avenue for negotiation. It is a closed loop." "Send it," I instructed. Evelyn tapped her keyboard. I authorized the digital delivery to their corporate counsel, she confirmed. Physical copies are being dispatched via overnight certified courier to the factory headquarters and to your parents' private residence. They will receive it by tomorrow morning. I closed my laptop and stood up, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling glass of my living room. The Phantom Raider had struck. The debt was mine. The trap was set, and the countdown had officially begun. My family had spent my entire life worshipping the illusion of male superiority, blindly trusting a son who offered them nothing but ruin. Tomorrow, the sun would rise over Grand Rapids, and Carter would open a heavy envelope that would shatter his fragile kingdom. The resulting shockwave would not just threaten their finances, it would expose the deep, festering vanity of a society that routinely hands crowns to jesters, while the queens build the castles in silence. Friday afternoon arrived with a crisp breeze rolling off the dark waters of Lake Michigan. Before the certified couriers delivered their heavy envelopes to the factory headquarters and the private estate, I had one final familial obligation to attend. My sister-in-law Vanessa had summoned me to a celebratory luncheon at the Macatawa Country Club. Vanessa grew up on the periphery of Grand Rapids' old money, harboring a desperate, calculating ambition to belong to the inner circle. She married my brother not for his intellect or his charm, but for the Elizabeth surname and the inherited membership at this exact club. The Macatawa Country Club was a monument to Midwestern exclusivity. The driveway was lined with ancient weeping willow trees, leading up to a grand colonial clubhouse with pristine white columns. I handed the keys of my hired car to a valet and walked through the double-glass doors. The dining room was a symphony of clinking silver, hushed gossip, and the faint scent of expensive floral perfume mixed with roasted garlic. Waitstaff in starched white uniforms glided across the thick patterned carpets, carrying trays of sparkling wine and delicate seafood arrangements. I found Vanessa seated at a prime table near the terrace windows, bathed in the midday sunlight. She was surrounded by 3 other women who mirrored her exact aesthetic. They wore pastel cashmere sweaters draped perfectly over their shoulders and carried designer handbags that cost more than a factory machinist earned in 6 months. I approached the table wearing a simple, tailored navy sheath dress. I did not need to broadcast my net worth through loud logos or flashy accessories. I owned the mortgage on the building where her husband worked, metaphorically speaking, and that silent reality was the only accessory I required. "Audrey, you actually made it," Vanessa announced. Her voice was pitched artificially high, engineered to ensure the neighboring tables heard her greeting. She stood up, offering a fragile, performative embrace that involved touching cheeks while kissing the empty air. "I am so glad you could tear yourself away from your little spreadsheets to celebrate with us. It means so much to Carter that you are trying to be supportive during his big week." I took the empty seat across from her, folding my hands softly in my lap. "Thank you for the invitation, Vanessa," I replied smoothly. A waiter materialized instantly, pouring sparkling water into my crystal glass with a practiced flick of his wrist. I looked at the women flanking her. They offered polite, tight smiles, clearly briefed on my designated role as the tragic, unmarried career woman who had lost the succession battle. Vanessa signaled the waiter to bring another round of mimosas for the table, placing the order on her tab. I knew that tab was tethered directly to the Elizabeth Machining executive expense line. I was effectively buying her drinks with my own collateral. The conversation flowed like poisoned honey. As the waiter distributed plates of seared tuna and delicate microgreens, Vanessa directed the discussion toward her new elevated responsibilities as the wife of a chief executive officer. "It is just such a heavy burden Carter carries now," she sighed delicately, stirring her drink with a silver swizzle stick. "He is responsible for so many families, so many blue-collar workers who rely on his genius to feed their children. The legacy of the town is entirely on his shoulders. He works so hard to keep everything afloat." She looked at me, tilting her head in feigned sympathy, a practiced look of pity washing over her features. "It must be so difficult for you to understand that kind of pressure, Audrey. Being alone in the city, working those terrible hours for faceless corporations, You miss out on the true meaning of family values. I picked up my fork, pressing the tines into a piece of seared tuna. I did not feel the sting she intended to inflict. I felt only a profound clinical amusement. Vanessa was a creature built on fragile social validation, projecting her deep insecurities onto a woman who could buy and sell her entire existence before breakfast. You certainly have a unique perspective on family values, I answered, taking a slow, deliberate bite of my lunch. One of Vanessa's friends, a woman wearing oversized designer sunglasses indoors, chimed in to support the attack. Vanessa says, "You work in private equity, Audrey. That sounds so intimidating for a woman. Do men find that off-putting? I hear corporate girls have a hard time keeping a husband because they are too bossy and focused on money." Vanessa let out a musical, condescending laugh, reaching over to touch her friend's arm. "Oh, leave poor Audrey alone," she scolded gently, though her eyes gleamed with malice. "Not everyone is built for marriage and motherhood. Some women are just destined to be married to their jobs. Audrey is so strong and independent, it just scares the men away. Carter always says she lacks the nurturing instinct required to build a real home. We cannot all be lucky enough to find a true partnership." I maintained a serene, unbroken expression. I did not defend my femininity, my choices, or my relationship status. I simply watched Vanessa raise her left hand to signal the waiter for more bread. As her arm caught the brilliant sunlight pouring through the terrace windows, a blinding flash of refracted light danced across the white linen tablecloth. Encircling her slender wrist was a brand-new, exquisite diamond tennis bracelet. It was a heavy, substantial piece, set in gleaming platinum, radiating a cold, expensive fire. The stones were flawless, cut with precision, and uniformly matched. "Oh, Vanessa," one of the women gasped, dropping her fork and grabbing her friend's hand. "Is that new? It is breathtaking." Vanessa offered a modest theatrical blush, lowering her eyelashes. She twisted her wrist slowly, allowing the diamonds to catch the light from every possible angle, ensuring everyone at the table absorbed the carat weight. "It was a surprise from Carter," she murmured, her voice dripping with artificial humility. "He bought it yesterday to celebrate his promotion. He said a CEO needs a wife who shines just as bright as his future. He is just so generous, always putting his family first." I stared at the jewelry, the ambient noise of the dining room fading into a dull hum. My mind instantly accessed the digital ledgers I had reviewed the night before. I knew exactly where that specific purchase originated. An anomaly had appeared in the accounts payable column late Wednesday afternoon. Carter had drawn exactly $20,000 from the Secondary Equipment Maintenance Fund. He diverted vital capital meant to repair the failing, dangerous cooling systems on the factory floor to purchase decorative carbon for his wife. He traded the safety and livelihood of the men he supposedly cared so much about for a shiny trinket to stroke his own ego. The dramatic irony of the moment was exquisite, a silent symphony of impending ruin. Vanessa sat there weaponizing her status, parading her diamonds to prove her superiority over the spinster sister-in-law. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that she was wearing stolen corporate funds. More importantly, she was wearing my money. Because I had purchased the corporate debt, I was the senior secured creditor of Elizabeth Machining. That bracelet was financed by the very liabilities I now owned. I was essentially looking at $20,000 of my own capital resting on her wrist. Lunch concluded with a final round of espresso and delicate lemon pastries. The waiter approached the table, placing the black leather folio containing the check directly next to Vanessa. She reached for her designer purse with a slow, exaggerated motion, intending to pay the exorbitant bill with the corporate black card Carter had provided her. I moved faster. I reached across the linen tablecloth, sliding the leather folio toward my side of the table. "I will take care of this," I said, withdrawing my personal titanium credit card from my clutch. Vanessa blinked in surprise, her hand hovering uselessly in the air. "Oh, Audrey, you do not have to do that," she protested weakly, her performative grace faltering for a second. Carter insists we treat you today, especially since you are going through such a tough transition, having to watch him take over the business. I handed the heavy metal card to the waiter, who accepted it with a crisp nod. It is my pleasure, Vanessa, I insisted, my voice smooth and unwavering. I truly wanted to treat you today. Consider it a parting gift. I smiled warmly at her. It was a genuine, radiant smile that caused her eyes to widen slightly in confusion. She did not understand the joke. She did not know that a certified courier vehicle had already pulled into the factory loading dock across town. She did not realize that the heavy envelope containing the 47-page notice of default was currently making its way to her husband's desk. I signed the receipt, leaving a generous tip for the waiter, and stood up from the table. I smoothed the clean lines of my navy dress and offered a final pleasant nod to the table of staring women. "Enjoy the bracelet, Vanessa," I said softly, looking directly into her eyes. "It truly is a remarkable piece of history. Make sure you keep the receipt." I turned and walked out of the Makatawa Country Club, my heels clicking a steady, unhurried rhythm against the hardwood floors of the lobby. I stepped out into the bright Michigan afternoon, leaving them to their mimosas and their hollow victories. It was the last luxurious meal my sister-in-law would ever eat on the company dime, and the very last afternoon she would ever spend believing she was untouchable. The certified courier required a direct signature upon delivery. I knew the precise minute the heavy manila envelope breached the front reception desk of Elizabeth Machining, because I was watching the delivery portal refresh on my secondary monitor. It was 2:14 on Friday afternoon. I had returned to my Detroit office following the country club luncheon, trading the scent of expensive perfume for the sterile, filtered air of my corporate sanctuary. I did not have to guess how my brother reacted when the package landed on his desk. 3 years ago, under the guise of a comprehensive cybersecurity upgrade, I had convinced my father to install high-definition security cameras in the executive suites. He believed it was to deter corporate espionage from rival engineering firms. In reality, it provided me with a silent, unfiltered window into the decay of his empire. I opened the encrypted video feed on my terminal. The camera angle offered a perfect, unobstructed view of Carter, sitting behind his sprawling mahogany desk. The receptionist entered the frame, placing the thick envelope directly in front of him. Carter dismissed her with a wave of his hand, too absorbed in his smartphone to look up. He assumed it was routine vendor paperwork. He picked up a silver letter opener, sliced through the reinforced seal, and pulled out the 47 pages of dense, unyielding contractual enforcement drafted by Evelyn. I watched the exact second the illusion of his leadership evaporated. Carter leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes scanning the first page. The header clearly identified Ironclad Holdings as the new senior secured creditor. The text below it outlined the immediate acceleration of the $8 million principal. The words were a legal guillotine, descending without a single grace period. His posture crumbled. The smug, country club confidence he wore like a tailored suit dissolved into raw, unfiltered terror. He dropped the documents onto the desk as if the paper had burned his fingers. He stood up, knocking his heavy ceramic coffee mug onto the carpet, spilling dark liquid across the pristine fibers. He did not bother to clean it. He began pacing the length of his office, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair, tugging at the knot of his silk tie until it hung loose around his collar. A competent executive would have gathered the documents, walked straight into the chairman's office, and initiated a crisis management protocol. A leader would have faced the consequences. But Carter was not a leader. He was a fragile imposter, terrified of his father. Instead of seeking help, he succumbed to the psychology of a coward. I watched him scramble back to his desk, gather the sprawling pages of the default notice, and shove them hastily into his bottom drawer, locking it with a small brass key. He believed that if he hid the paper, he could hide the reality. My digital monitoring software flared to life a few moments later. The keystroke logger on his terminal recorded a flurry of frantic activity. Carter opened a private browsing window and began searching for immediate commercial capital. His queries were a testament to his desperation. He searched for bridge loans, high-yield mezzanine debt, and unregulated hard money lenders. He was attempting to borrow $8 million in a single afternoon, with zero collateral and a destroyed balance sheet. It was the financial equivalent of trying to stop a hemorrhage with a single adhesive bandage. Over the next 48 hours, I watched his credit inquiries spike across the financial wire. He submitted applications to shadow lenders who charged exorbitant double-digit interest rates. Every single algorithm rejected him instantly. The risk was too high, the timeline too short, and his credibility too compromised. While Carter spent the weekend drowning in digital rejections, the true cost of his incompetence began to manifest on the factory floor. By Tuesday morning, the blue-collar reality of Elizabeth Machining crashed into a solid wall of economic starvation. My private line rang just before 10 o'clock. It was Thomas, the veteran floor manager. The background noise on his end of the call was wrong. A manufacturing facility is supposed to roar. It should vibrate with the rhythmic thud of stamping presses and the high-pitched whine of cutting tools. Today, the background was eerily silent. "Audrey, we have a catastrophic situation," Thomas said, his voice stripped of its usual stoic calm. "The primary steel supplier just froze our account. They refused to release the flatbed trucks from their depot. We are completely out of raw tungsten and carbon steel." "Have you spoken to procurement?" I asked, tracing the rim of my coffee cup. "Procurement cannot do anything." Thomas sighed heavily. "The vendor claims we are 90 days past due on a $500,000 invoice. The electrical utility provider also sent a final shut-off warning this morning. I had to power down the secondary milling centers to conserve the grid. The men are just standing around the break room, Audrey. We have orders to fill, but we cannot run the machines without steel or power." This was the fatal flaw in my father's philosophy. Richard Elizabeth worshipped grit. He believed that physical endurance and a strong jawline were the only requirements for industrial success. But grit cannot negotiate a term sheet. Sweat cannot appease a panicked creditor. When the supply chain demands hard currency, all the blue-collar pride in the world will not turn the lights back on. I told Thomas to keep the men calm and instructed him to wait for management to address the floor. I knew management was currently hiding in a locked office, staring at a ringing telephone he was too afraid to answer. The silence of the factory floor is what finally drew my father out of his study. I brought the executive security feed back onto my primary monitor. I watched Richard march down the hallway, his posture rigid with indignation. He burst into Carter's office without knocking. Even without audio, the fury radiating from my father was palpable. He pointed toward the window overlooking the silent factory, demanding to know why the production lines were halted mid-shift. Carter shrank into his chair. He stammered, offering weak gestures and shaking his head. He tried to point at his computer screen, fabricating another lie about supply chain bottlenecks or shipping errors. Richard did not accept the excuse. He leaned over the desk, invading his son's space, demanding the raw ledger data. Carter panicked. In his frantic attempt to pull up a fake spreadsheet, he knocked his elbow against his keyboard tray. The sudden movement dislodged the small brass key he had left resting near the edge. It clattered onto the floor, rolling directly over the toes of my father's leather shoes. Richard looked down. He recognized the key to the bottom drawer, the drawer Carter had sworn was jammed months ago. My father possessed many flaws, but he was not blind to deception when it unfolded directly in front of him. He bent down, retrieved the key, and shoved Carter aside. Carter raised his hands, begging his father to stop, but Richard ignored him. He unlocked the drawer and pulled out the thick, heavy stack of paper bearing the ironclad holdings watermark. I leaned closer to my monitor, watching the dynasty fracture. Richard flipped to the first page. I watched his eyes track the bold capitalized words demanding $8 million. I watched his ruddy complexion turn a dangerous chalky white. The document outlined every missed payment, every breached covenant, and every diverted fund Carter had squandered on luxury vehicles and country club dinners. It detailed the imminent seizure of the very ground they stood on. The confrontation that followed was a physical manifestation of a broken legacy. Richard threw the entire 47-page document directly at his son's chest. The heavy pages scattered across the office like a flock of dead birds. He grabbed Carter by the lapels of his golf shirt, hauling him out of the leather chair. Carter raised his arms to shield his face, cowering before the man he had spent his entire life trying to impress. Richard shook him, his mouth forming words of profound, devastating disappointment. The golden boy, the heir apparent, chosen for his physical grit, was weeping in the center of the room, exposed as a fraud who had signed the death warrant of a century-old empire. Richard shoved him backward. Carter stumbled, crashing into a heavy wooden bookcase, sending framed awards and acrylic plaques tumbling to the carpet. My father stood over the wreckage, his chest heaving, staring at the scattered pages of the default notice. He realized in that exact moment that the kingdom he built was gone. It had been sold to a phantom in the night, traded away by a son who did not know the value of the dirt beneath his boots. I closed the video feed, the silence of my Detroit office wrapping around me like a velvet cloak. The first strike was a flawless victory. The old guard was broken, turning on each other in the dark. Now it was time for them to drag their pride to the negotiating table and meet the phantom face to face. My father did not spend the weekend offering comfort to his weeping son. Richard Elizabeth operated under a singular, antiquated belief system where emotion was a liability and loud voices solved complex problems. By Monday morning, Carter was banished from the executive suite, relegated to a windowless conference room down the hall. Richard reclaimed the heavy mahogany desk, surrounding himself with the scattered pages of the default notice. He smoothed the crinkled paper, his eyes locking on to the contact information listed beneath the Ironclad Holdings letterhead. He picked up the receiver of the landline, his knuckles white with tension. He dialed the Manhattan area code, preparing to deploy the same tactics he used to bully local suppliers and intimidate union representatives. He assumed Ironclad Holdings was just another faceless group of junior analysts who could be charmed, threatened, or negotiated into submission by a booming voice and a legacy surname. He did not realize he was dialing a direct line to Evelyn. My corporate attorney did not possess a heart that could be swayed by Midwestern nostalgia. She was a legal mercenary. I sat in my Detroit office, listening to the recorded audio feed of the call a few hours later. "This is Richard Elizabeth," my father barked into the phone, skipping any formal greeting. "I am the chairman of Elizabeth Machining. I am looking at this notice your firm sent over. There has been a clerical misunderstanding regarding our commercial note. I need to speak with the managing partner in charge of this portfolio immediately." The line remained silent for 2 beats. Evelyn let his bluster hang in the empty air, stripping it of its power. "Mr. Elizabeth," Evelyn replied, her voice a flat, unyielding sheet of ice. "I am the authorized representative for Ironclad Holdings. There is no clerical misunderstanding. Your firm is in default of 7 separate lending covenants. The principal balance of $8 million is due immediately." "Listen to me very carefully, young lady," Richard warned, lowering his voice into a gravelly register designed to intimidate. "We have been pouring steel in this state since 1922. We hit a temporary cash flow snag because of supply chain delays. I am prepared to offer a partial interest payment today to show good faith. You will withdraw this default notice, and we will renegotiate the amortization schedule next quarter." Evelyn did not sigh. She did not raise her pitch. "We do not accept partial interest payments on accelerated debt, Mr. Elizabeth. We do not renegotiate. We do not operate on good faith. We operate on contractual enforcement. You have less than 5 days to wire the full $8 million to our escrow account. If the funds do not clear, we will initiate asset seizure protocols." "Who runs this firm?" Richard demanded, his composure fracturing. "Who is your boss? Give me a name. I know the board members at every major equity house in Chicago and New York. I will call your superiors and have you removed from this account. Ironclad Holdings is a private entity, Evelyn stated smoothly. The ownership structure is confidential. My instructions are final. Produce the capital or surrender the collateral. Have your corporate counsel contact my office to arrange the transfer. Do not call this number again. The recording ended with the sharp click of the line disconnecting, followed by the dull dial tone. My father had slammed his phone down so hard it cracked the plastic receiver. He had finally met a predator that did not care about his grandfather's legacy or the volume of his voice. He was backed into a corner, blind and bleeding. It took less than a day for the panic to override his pride. On Tuesday afternoon, my personal cell phone buzzed. It was not a request for a visit. It was a summons. I drove back to Grand Rapids, the sky above the highway an unforgiving blanket of gray clouds. The atmosphere inside the Elizabeth estate had shifted from suffocating arrogance to raw desperation. When I walked through the front doors, the silence was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the brass grandfather clock. My parents were waiting for me in the formal living room, a space usually reserved for hosting local politicians and affluent neighbors. Today, it felt like a waiting room in a terminal ward. Catherine sat perched on the edge of a velvet armchair, holding a porcelain teacup with trembling hands. Richard stood by the unlit fireplace, leaning heavily against the mantel. The past 4 days had aged him a decade. The rigid posture was gone, replaced by a slight, defeated stoop. "Audrey, thank God you are here," my mother said, placing the teacup down before she spilled it. She stood up and reached for my hands, her previous venom entirely forgotten, replaced by a cloying, desperate affection. "We did not know who else to call. We need your help." I let her hold my hands, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. I arranged my features into a mask of mild concern. "What has happened?" I asked softly. My father turned away from the mantel, running a hand over his face. "The bank sold our commercial note," he admitted, the words catching in his throat like broken glass. "They sold it to a private equity firm out of New York, Ironclad Holdings. They are demanding the entire $8 million balance. We tried to reason with them, but their representative is a machine. They are refusing to grant an extension. They are threatening to seize the factory." I guided my mother back to her chair and took a seat on the sofa across from them. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, playing the role of the attentive, worried daughter. "Ironclad Holdings," I repeated, testing the syllables on my tongue as if hearing them for the very first time. "That is a notoriously firm entity. They specialize in distressed asset acquisition. They buy bad debt for pennies and liquidate the collateral for a profit." "You work in this industry, Audrey," my father said, taking a step toward me. His eyes were wide, pleading. "You know these people. You know how these firms operate. You have connections in New York. We need you to use your network. Find out who sits on the board of this Ironclad group. Find out who is pulling the strings. If I can just get the owner on the phone, man to man, I can make them understand the value of our operation." The sheer, delicious irony of his request washed over me. He was standing in his sprawling mansion, stripped of his power, begging the daughter he had dismissed as a paper pusher to save him from the monster she had built. He wanted me to hunt down the architect of his ruin, oblivious to the fact that she was sitting on his velvet sofa, wearing a tailored navy suit, watching him beg. "I cannot call the owner, Richard," I said, maintaining a gentle, sorrowful tone. "Firms like Ironclad are shielded by layers of blind trusts and shell corporations. They are designed to be invisible. If they have issued a formal notice of default, the decision is already made. They do not want your interest payments. They want the real estate and the equipment." "There has to be a way out," my mother pleaded, tears pooling in her eyes. "Carter is falling apart. He has not slept in days. The suppliers are circling like vultures. We will lose everything." I looked at my mother, recalling the exact pitch of her voice when she called me a jealous spinster trying to sabotage her golden boy. I let a long, heavy silence fill the room, allowing their desperation to steep. There is only one logical path forward, I advised, keeping my voice steady and practical. You cannot produce $8 million in liquid capital. If you force them to seize the assets, they will drag you through a public bankruptcy. Your names will be printed in the local papers. The union will riot. You will walk away with nothing but legal fees and public humiliation. What are you suggesting? My father asked, his breath hitching. You must offer them a debt for equity swap. I explained, delivering the lethal advice with clinical precision. You surrender the majority voting shares of Elizabeth Machining to Ironclad Holdings. In exchange, they forgive the $8 million debt and assume control of the operations. You might be able to negotiate a small minority stake or a ceremonial board seat, but you must surrender control. It is the only way to avoid total liquidation. My father stared at me, the color returning to his face in a rush of furious red. His hands curled into tight fists at his sides. Surrender equity, he spat the word, tasting like poison. Hand over my grandfather's steel mills to a bunch of corporate vultures? Give them the keys to a kingdom my family built with our bare hands. It is no longer your kingdom, Richard, I reminded him gently. It belongs to the debt holders. You can hand them the keys, or they can break the door down. I will never surrender this company, he roared, the old stubborn patriarch flashing back to life. I will drain my retirement accounts. I will mortgage this house. I will fight them in every court in Michigan before I let some faceless New York bankers steal my family name. I stood up, smoothing the front of my suit jacket. I had planted the seed. I had offered them the only lifeline, knowing his ego would force him to reject it. They were trapped in a burning room, and they had just bolted the only exit shut. I wish you the best of luck, Richard, I said softly, but pride will not pay the margins. I walked out of the formal living room, leaving them alone with the ticking clock. I drove back to Detroit in silence. The familial ties were severed, the emotional weight lifted. I was no longer a daughter managing a family crisis. I was an executive closing a hostile takeover. The next morning, the trap snapped shut. Evelyn dispatched a formal legal summons to Elizabeth Machining. The document was succinct and devoid of any negotiation tactics. It mandated a mandatory restructuring meeting to be held at a neutral corporate boardroom in downtown Detroit. The letter stated that failure to attend would result in immediate asset seizure warrants being filed with the state courts. My father had run out of time, he had run out of money, and he had run out of options. The prey was finally cornered, and the hunter was waiting in a glass tower. The glass-walled conference room on the 60th floor of my Detroit firm offered a panoramic view of the dark, churning river. The architecture of the space was engineered specifically to make visitors feel exposed. There were no heavy curtains, no warm wooden wainscoting, and nowhere to hide. My father, my brother, and their corporate counsel sat on one side of a vast, chilled slate table. I observed them through the tinted glass of the adjacent security suite before making my entrance. Carter was sweating profusely, the damp patches blooming beneath the arms of his pale blue dress shirt. He tapped a frantic, erratic rhythm against his knee, his eyes darting toward the heavy mahogany doors every few seconds. Richard sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles flickered beneath his skin. He stared at the empty black leather chair positioned at the head of the table. He was bracing to face a titan. He was preparing to meet the phantom predator who had stripped his empire down to the studs in a matter of days. Beside them sat Harold, a relic of a bygone era. Harold was an estate attorney who still carried a scuffed briefcase from the 1980s, a man accustomed to executing simple wills and notarizing country club deeds. He was entirely out of his depth in a high-finance restructuring matrix, nervously shuffling a stack of useless balance sheets. They were three men representing a dying ideology, armed with nothing but unearned confidence and a fundamental misunderstanding of modern economics. The digital clock on the wall shifted to exactly 10 in the morning. I signaled Evelyn with a single nod. She pushed open the frosted doors and stepped into the room. She wore a sharp obsidian suit exuding a frigid authority. She did not introduce herself or offer a hand to shake. She bypassed the pleasantries entirely, walking to the center of the slate table and placing a thick leather folder down with a soft, definitive thud. Richard sat up straighter, trying to project strength, puffing out his chest. Carter visibly shrank, his tapping knee freezing instantly. They held their collective breath, waiting for the owner of Ironclad Holdings to walk through the threshold. I stepped into the room 10 seconds later. I wore the flawless charcoal gray bespoke suit I had laid out days ago, paired with a crisp white silk blouse. My stilettos struck the polished concrete floor with a rhythmic, unhurried cadence. I carried no briefcase, no tablet, and no paperwork. True power never carries its own ledgers. My father turned his head. His expression instantly morphed from terrified anticipation to irritated confusion. He glared at me, the veins in his neck pressing against his collar, his face flushing a deep crimson. "Audrey, what in the world are you doing here?" he snapped, his voice dropping into a harsh, condescending whisper. "This is a closed corporate negotiation. Did your mother send you? I told you we do not need your help. Get out of here before the real executives arrive. You are going to embarrass the family." I did not stop walking. I bypassed the row of empty guest chairs. I glided past Harold, who was peering at me over the rim of his bifocals with utter bewilderment. I reached the head of the table. I stood beside the seat of the chairman, the very seat my father believed belonged exclusively to men with grease on their hands and steel in their veins. I pulled the heavy leather chair back and sat down. I rested my forearms on the cool slate surface, linking my fingers together. I looked directly into my father's eyes. The room was so incredibly quiet, I could hear the faint, frantic ticking of Carter's luxury wristwatch across the wide table. "I am Ironclad Holdings," I said. My voice was perfectly level, devoid of any anger, theatrics, or hesitation. It was a simple, clinical statement of absolute fact. The resulting silence was not merely quiet, it was a vacuum. It sucked the oxygen straight out of the room. I watched reality fracture my father's worldview into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The ruddy color drained from his face in a single, terrifying rush, leaving behind an ashen, hollow shell. His mouth parted slightly, but his vocal cords failed to produce a single sound. He stared at me, his eyes widening with a horrific realization. The daughter he had dismissed, the woman he had ordered to step aside, the spinster he claimed pushed imaginary paper, was the apex predator who had swallowed his legacy whole. Carter's reaction was much more visceral. He stopped breathing. His chest hitched, accelerating into short, shallow gasps. He looked at Evelyn, then at me, then down at the restructuring documents bearing the Ironclad logo. The sheer weight of his own incompetence, combined with the shock of my identity, overloaded his fragile nervous system. He let out a strange, high-pitched wheeze. His eyes rolled backward, showing the whites of his sclera. He swayed dangerously to the left, slipping sideways out of his chair, and collapsed onto the polished concrete floor in a dead faint. Harold cried out, dropping his useless balance sheets and scrambling out of his seat to kneel beside my brother. Richard remained frozen, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his defeat, unable to even look down at his unconscious son. I did not flinch. I did not stand up to check his pulse. I remained seated at the head of the table, my expression serene. Evelyn stood nearby, equally unmoved, her hands clasped respectfully in front of her. We waited. The chaotic display of weakness on the floor was not our concern. It took nearly 2 minutes for Harold to slap Carter's cheeks and rouse him back to consciousness. My brother groaned, sitting up slowly, his custom golf shirt wrinkled and clinging to his damp chest. Harold grabbed him by the arm, hoisting him back into his leather chair like a discarded rag doll. Carter slumped forward, burying his face in his trembling hands, letting out a quiet, pathetic sob. Once the physical theatrics concluded and the men were back in their seats, I signaled Evelyn with a slight nod. She reached out and slid the thick leather folder across the slate table, stopping it precisely in front of my father's frozen hands. I leaned forward, closing the distance between the old regime and the new reality. "These are the new corporate bylaws," I stated, my tone surgical and precise. "You will notice that my equity stake is now recorded at 65%. The defaulted debt has been formally capitalized. You are no longer the owners of Elizabeth Machining. You are my minority shareholders. I suggest you read the transition parameters carefully, Richard. Your employment status is about to change." The paralysis gripping my father shattered. The initial suffocating shock morphed into a volatile, red-hot fury. The color returned to his face in an angry, mottled flush, spreading from his collar to the roots of his thinning hair. He lunged forward, planting both palms flat against the slate table, with enough force to rattle the glass walls of the conference room. "You deceptive, treacherous thief!" Richard roared, the sound tearing through his throat. His voice was a booming, cavernous echo, the sound of a patriarch watching his kingdom burn. "You dare to walk into this room and claim my grandfather's legacy as your own. You stole this company. You committed fraud. I will hire every litigator in the Midwest to drag you through the courts until you are disbarred, destitute, and begging for a job in a mailroom. You are no daughter of mine. You are a parasite." Carter shrank further into his leather chair, trembling, unable to look at the man shouting beside him. Harold, the antiquated estate attorney, nervously adjusted his spectacles, his hands fluttering over his useless stack of papers, attempting to find a legal precedent that did not exist. I did not raise my voice to match my father's volume. I did not need to shout. I simply opened the slender black dossier resting beneath my fingertips. "I did not steal anything, Richard," I replied, my tone carrying the clinical, detached precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. "I rescued a drowning asset from the bankruptcy courts. Your chosen heir was driving it toward." I slid the first sheet of paper across the smooth slate surface. It came to rest directly over the transition documents. "Let us review the ledger," I suggested, tapping the page with my index finger. "When I purchased your commercial note last week, Elizabeth Machining was bleeding capital at a terminal velocity. Your debt service coverage ratio had plummeted below 1.0. You were drawing on high-interest overdraft lines merely to cover the weekly payroll. The business was technically insolvent. If Ironclad Holdings had not acquired the paper, the regional bank was preparing to freeze your operating accounts and chain the factory doors on Monday morning. I did not take your empire. I bought the wreckage you created." My father sneered, refusing to look at the spreadsheet. "You manipulated the system," he spat, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "You used your Wall Street connections to stab your own flesh and blood in the back." Carter was turning a corner. He secured new contracts. We just needed a bridge loan to smooth out the transition. Carter let out a soft, pathetic whimper, pulling at the cuffs of his damp shirt. He knew the truth was about to be laid bare on the table. "Your son did not secure new contracts," I corrected, pulling a second document from the dossier. "He cannibalized your profit margins to sign a secondary automotive distributor, guaranteeing a loss of $1.50 on every single unit produced. And while he was bleeding the factory dry to play the role of an industrial titan, he was simultaneously embezzling vital capital." I flipped to the specific anomaly in the accounts payable column. I highlighted a very specific routing number. Last Wednesday, while the shop floor managers were begging for funds to repair the failing cooling systems on the milling line, Carter diverted $20,000 from the equipment maintenance budget, I stated, turning my gaze toward my brother. He used corporate funds to purchase a platinum diamond tennis bracelet for his wife. He celebrated his unearned promotion by stealing from the very men who pour the steel. Richard froze. The fiery indignation faltered, replaced by a cold, creeping horror. He slowly turned his head, looking down at his son. Carter squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head in a feeble, silent denial, tears leaking into his collar. My father looked back at me, his jaw trembling. "That is an accounting error," he whispered, the booming authority bleeding out of his voice. "My son would never steal from the floor." "The transaction receipts are attached to page 4, I advised calmly. "But the financial decay does not end with his incompetence. It extends directly to your vanity, Richard." I withdrew the final diagnostic report. "For the past decade, you refused to upgrade the analog engineering models. You rejected computer numerical control automation because you believed it lacked the authenticity of manual labor. Your stubborn adherence to outdated manufacturing techniques resulted in a 30% material scrap rate. You bled $70,000 a month in ruined tungsten and warped carbon steel. You ran this business into the ground long before Carter took the helm. You were just too arrogant to read the balance sheet." Harold cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound. He attempted to interject, trying to justify his billing hours.
"Now, see here, young lady,"
Harold stammered, raising a trembling hand.
"There are fiduciary duties to consider. You cannot simply execute a hostile takeover without board approval. We will file an injunction based on predatory lending practices."
Evelyn stepped forward, cutting the old lawyer down with a single freezing glance. "Do not embarrass yourself," Harold Evelyn instructed, her voice slicing through the room like a silver blade. "The Uniform Commercial Code filings are pristine. The original loan covenants, which your client signed 3 years ago, included an explicit acceleration clause and a waiver of the automatic stay in the event of default. My firm executed the debt transfer legally. The notice was delivered within the mandated window. You have zero legal recourse. If you attempt to file a frivolous injunction, I will personally see you sanctioned by the State Bar Association for wasting judicial resources." Harold swallowed hard, lowering his hand and shrinking back into his seat. The last fragile pillar of my father's defense crumbled into dust. I closed the black dossier, folding my hands back together on top of the slate. "Here is your new reality," I announced, projecting my voice to ensure every syllable struck its target. "Through the capitalization of the defaulted debt, Ironclad Holdings now possesses 65% of the voting shares in Elizabeth Machining. I own the controlling interest. I dictate the operational budget. I control the board. You are no longer the kings of this city. You are my minority shareholders." The psychological destruction unfolding across my father's face was a profound thing to witness. The Rust Belt patriarch, a man who had spent his entire life measuring worth by physical strength and male inheritance, was forced to look at his daughter and recognize a ruthless, calculating power he never possessed. He realized that the quiet girl he had ignored at the dinner table had evolved into an apex predator. He saw his own grandfather's cold industrial ambition reflected in my eyes, refined and weaponized by modern financial dominance. He had no defense against it. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He leaned heavily against the table, his breath coming in ragged, defeated exhales. The kingdom was lost, conquered without a single drop of blood being spilled, erased by ink and contractual leverage. I stood up, smoothing the tailored lines of my charcoal suit. I pushed the leather folder containing the new corporate bylaws toward the center of the table. "You have exactly 24 hours to review and sign the transition papers," I said, looking down at the broken men before me. "If those documents are not executed and returned to Evelyn by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, I will initiate immediate asset liquidation. I will sell the real estate, auction the machinery for scrap, and dissolve the company entirely." I picked up my empty dossier. I did not wait for a response, an apology, or a plea for mercy. I turned and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors, my stilettos echoing against the polished concrete. The trap had sprung, the prey was subdued, and the next phase of the restructuring was about to begin. If they wanted to keep their names on the building, they were going to have to learn how to wear the golden handcuffs I had just placed on the table. The transition documents arrived at 9:45 on Wednesday morning, exactly 15 minutes before the deadline. I reviewed the scanned files on my high-definition monitor. My father's signature, usually a bold, sweeping declaration of his ego, was small and erratic. The ink trailed off at the edges, reflecting a man whose hand trembled under the weight of his own defeat. Beside it, Carter had signed his name in a hurried, messy scrawl. The legal transfer was executed. Ironclad Holdings owned the kingdom. I closed my laptop and requested my driver. It was time to rearrange the furniture in my new house. I bypassed the main corporate entrance and walked directly onto the production floor. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and cutting fluid. The rhythmic thud of the stamping presses vibrated through the soles of my shoes. The workers paused, casting uncertain glances toward me. They recognized the boss's daughter, but they did not yet know I was the owner. I did not stop to make a speech. I proceeded straight to the executive suites. My father was sitting behind the mahogany desk, staring blankly at a framed photograph of my grandfather. He did not look up when I entered. I placed a single sheet of paper on the leather blotter. Your new employment contract. Richard, the first announced, my tone brisk and unyielding. You are transitioning to the role of honorary chairman. You will retain a base salary sufficient to maintain your primary residence. However, you possess zero executive authority. You will not sign checks. You will not negotiate vendor terms. You will vacate this office by noon. Your new desk is located in the secondary administrative annex. Richard finally raised his head. His eyes were hollow, stripped of their former fire. The annex was a small, outdated building near the loading docks, primarily used for storing old blueprints and surplus office supplies. It was a physical manifestation of his irrelevance. He opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He picked up a pen and signed the paper, securing his own exile. I found my brother lurking in the break room, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. He looked up, his posture defensive and fearful. I handed him a separate folder, along with a pair of heavy steel-toed boots and a neon yellow safety vest. Your executive tenure is over, Carter, I stated. You are now the junior supply chain supervisor. Your salary is capped at $60,000 a year. You will report to the loading dock every morning at 6. You are responsible for logging inbound freight and conducting daily inventory audits. Carter stared at the heavy work boots, his jaw dropping in disbelief. I have a business degree, he protested, his voice cracking. I cannot work on the loading dock like a common laborer. I am the son of the founder. You are an employee of Ironclad Holdings. I corrected my gaze, piercing his fragile pride. Your performance metrics are strict. If you miscount a single pallet, if you delay a freight carrier by more than 10 minutes, or if you fail to meet the daily quota, you will be terminated with cause. There is no severance package. There is no safety net. Put on the boots, Carter, or leave the premises right now. He swallowed hard, his face pale, and slowly reached for the safety vest. The golden handcuffs snapped shut. I returned to the corner office and logged into the primary corporate banking portal. My first objective was severing the financial leeches draining the operational budget. I isolated the secondary credit cards issued to my mother and my sister-in-law. For years, Catherine and Vanessa had treated the company coffers like a personal slush fund, charging lavish vacations, designer wardrobes, and spa retreats to the business. I highlighted both accounts. I pressed a single key. The screen flashed a confirmation message. The accounts were deactivated. The flow of unearned capital ceased instantly. Across town, the consequences of that keystroke unfolded in real time. Vanessa was spending her afternoon at the Makatawa Country Club, indulging in a premium hot stone massage followed by a champagne lunch. She approached the polished marble reception desk, flanked by her usual entourage of status-obsessed acquaintances. She casually handed her corporate black card to the club manager, expecting the usual deferential treatment. The manager swiped the card. The terminal beeped a sharp, negative tone. He frowned and swiped it a second time. The result was identical. "I am sorry, Mrs. Elizabeth," the manager murmured, leaning forward to keep his voice low. "The transaction is declined. Furthermore, I received an automated alert from our billing department this morning. Your membership dues were returned for insufficient funds. Your account is currently suspended." Vanessa turned crimson. Her friends, women who only valued her for her access to wealth, stepped back, their polite smiles freezing into masks of quiet judgment. She fumbled in her designer purse, searching for a personal card she knew was already maxed out. She was forced to leave her lunch unpaid, fleeing the clubhouse under the scrutinizing whispers of the elite circle she had tried so desperately to join. Her social currency evaporated in the span of 30 seconds. Back at the factory, I summoned Thomas to the executive suite. The veteran floor manager walked in with a grim expression, clutching his grease-stained hard hat. He sat down, expecting to receive a pink slip from the ruthless new corporate owner. "Thomas, you have kept this facility running despite a profound lack of competent leadership." I began sliding a pristine folder across the desk. "I am restructuring the hierarchy. Merit and competence are the only metrics that matter moving forward. I am naming you the Vice President of Operations." Thomas blinked, staring at the title printed on the contract. He read the compensation package, his eyes widening. It included a substantial salary increase, full medical benefits, and a performance-based profit-sharing plan. "You are putting me in charge of the entire floor?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I am giving you the authority you always deserved," I confirmed. "You know the machines, you know the men. Fix the cooling systems, rebuild the supply chain. You have my full backing." Thomas signed the contract without a second thought. When he returned to the production floor and announced the change in leadership, the blue-collar workers erupted into a chorus of cheers. They realized the era of unearned privilege was dead. The factory belonged to the people who actually understood how to pour the steel. The following weeks settled into a grueling, undeniable reality for my family. Carter spent his days sweating on the concrete loading docks, enduring the searing Michigan summer heat. He wrestled with heavy wooden pallets, his soft, manicured hands developing thick blisters and deep calluses. He was forced to take orders from men he used to patronize. The sheer physical exhaustion stripped away his arrogant facade, leaving behind a bitter, resentful shell. My father fared no better. Stripped of his identity, Richard became a ghost haunting his own life. He spent his days wandering the sprawling halls of the Tudor estate, wearing a velvet bathrobe late into the afternoon. He stared out the windows, watching the manicured lawns, a king exiled to his own living room. The ceremonial annex office at the factory remained empty. He could not bear the humiliation of walking past his former employees to sit at a desk with a dead phone line. I consolidated my control from the corner office, stabilizing the cash flow and renegotiating vendor terms with clinical efficiency. The business began to heal. The bleeding stopped. But peace is a fragile construct when built on the ruins of someone else's ego. The humiliation festering inside my brother proved to be a dangerous catalyst. Carter dragged his exhausted, aching body home every evening to a house consumed by rage. Vanessa, stripped of her country club status and her diamond budget, directed all her fury at her husband. She screamed at him for his weakness, demanding he reclaim their stolen lifestyle. She refused to be the wife of a lowly warehouse clerk. Her toxic urging ignited a desperate spark in Carter's mind. He knew he could never outsmart me in a boardroom. He could never outmaneuver my legal team. But his new role on the loading dock granted him unfettered access to the shipping manifests, the client directories, and the proprietary engineering schematics stored in the outbound logistics server.
Driven by wounded pride and his wife's relentless screaming, Carter began lurking in the warehouse after hours. He stared at the glowing green numbers on the inventory screens, plotting a desperate, illegal countermove. If he could not inherit the crown, he decided he would sell the castle's secrets to the highest bidder. The silence of the factory was about to be broken by an act of outright treason. The loading dock stripped my brother of his unearned pride during the daylight hours, but the true psychological torment waited for him at home. Vanessa could not tolerate the stark reality of a working-class husband. Every evening when Carter returned to their heavily mortgaged suburban house, smelling of diesel exhaust, stale sweat, and industrial solvent, she unleashed a torrent of sharp, degrading complaints. She reminded him of the country club luncheons she could no longer attend, the elite social circles that had exiled her, and the diamond tennis bracelet she could no longer flaunt. She called him a coward for surrendering his birthright. She demanded he find a way to reclaim their stolen status, threatening to leave him if he failed to provide the luxury she felt entitled to possess. Carter, desperate to appease a woman who only loved his surname, turned his wounded ego into a blunt weapon. He lacked the intellect to build a profitable enterprise, but sabotage requires a much lower threshold of competence. As a supply chain supervisor, Carter possessed entry-level access to the shipping and receiving logistics terminals. He knew the delivery schedules for our oldest and most lucrative client, a premier Detroit automaker that accounted for nearly 40% of our annual revenue. This specific contract was the lifeblood of Elizabeth Machining, a historic partnership forged by our grandfather decades ago. Carter reached out to a rival machining firm located across town, a company hungry for automotive contracts, but lacking our precision engineering capabilities. He offered to siphon the automaker's orders directly into their hands. He promised to deliver our proprietary die casting schematics in exchange for a lucrative off-the-books consulting fee. It was a classic kickback scheme. It was a clumsy, desperate crime born of pure entitlement. On a rainy Thursday night, the factory floor stood mostly empty. The second shift had clocked out, leaving only a skeleton crew monitoring the automated kilns in the far wing. Carter parked his compact commuter car in a dark, unlit corner of the employee lot, far away from the main entrance. He wore a dark jacket pulled tight against the damp chill, glancing over his shoulder like a petty thief acting out a scene in a low-budget film. He swiped his badge at the administrative annex, bypassing the main security desk. He slipped into a vacant logistical office, booting up a terminal connected to the central engineering database. I was 70 miles away, sitting in the quiet, temperature-controlled sanctuary of my Detroit penthouse. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass, blurring the city lights into long streaks of amber and crimson. I stood by the kitchen island, holding a delicate demi-tasse of dark, rich espresso. My secure tablet rested on the marble counter, illuminating the dim room with a stark white glow. During my tenure in private equity, I learned a fundamental truth about hostile takeovers and corporate restructuring. The greatest threat to operational stability never comes from external competitors. It always originates from the internal, bitter remnants of the old regime. When I purchased the debt before I ever revealed my identity in that glass boardroom, I had an elite cybersecurity firm install forensic monitoring protocols across the entire Elizabeth Machining network infrastructure. Every keystroke, every file transfer, and every unauthorized access attempt generated an encrypted alert routed directly to my personal server. My tablet chimed a soft, crystalline note slicing through the quiet apartment. I set the espresso down. The screen displayed a restricted access warning originating from the logistics annex. The user identification logged was Carter Elizabeth. I tapped the notification, opening a real-time mirror of his terminal on my display. I watched his cursor move across the screen with frantic, jerky motions. He bypassed the standard shipping manifests, diving deeper into the restricted architectural folders.
He was searching for the proprietary die-casting schematics, the exact intellectual property that allowed us to manufacture parts with a precision our rivals could not match. My brother believed he was a ghost, moving undetected through the machine. He thought his supervisor credentials granted him a cloak of invisibility. He did not understand that modern data security operates exactly like a digital tripwire. I had deliberately instructed the IT department to leave a breadcrumb trail, a minor vulnerability in the firewall architecture, allowing a low-level user to access the upper-tier files, provided they knew exactly where to look and possessed the corrupt intent to try. I wanted to see if he would take the bait. The cursor hovered over the master schematic folder. A command prompt appeared. He initiated a file transfer to an external, unregistered universal serial bus drive. A progress bar materialized on my tablet, slowly filling with a bright green hue. 10%, 20%, 30%. A novice executive would have panicked at the sight of proprietary data leaving the network. A traditional floor manager would have immediately contacted the network administrator, severing the connection and dispatching physical security to apprehend the culprit on the spot. They would have stopped the theft, but they would have only caught him in the planning phase. A competent defense attorney could argue that Carter was merely reviewing files for a complex inventory audit, claiming he misunderstood his clearance level. I did not want a circumstantial case involving intent. I required a fatal, undeniable blow. I took a slow sip of my espresso, enjoying the bitter, complex flavor profile rolling across my tongue. I watched the progress bar creep past 50%. I was letting him commit a federal felony on a live recorded feed. By allowing the data transfer to reach completion, I was ensuring the creation of an irrefutable digital chain of evidence. I was giving him exactly enough rope to hang himself. The files he was stealing were not unprotected documents. They contained microscopic digital watermarks, invisible tracking codes embedded deep within the metadata. The moment he handed that flash drive to the rival firm, the moment their engineers opened a single document on their network, my cybersecurity team would receive a ping, exposing the exact internet protocol address of the recipient. Carter was not just sabotaging his own career. He was delivering a radioactive payload to my competitor, handing me the precise legal leverage required to destroy them both in a single devastating lawsuit. The progress bar reached 100%. The transfer complete notification flashed across the screen. I watched his cursor move to safely eject the external drive. In the dark logistical office across the state, Carter slipped the flash drive into the pocket of his jacket. He wiped his sweating palms on his denim jeans, a nervous habit he possessed since childhood. He shut down the terminal, plunging the small room back into shadows. He walked out to his car, his heart pounding with the thrill of his treason. He drove away from the factory, convinced he had outsmarted the sister he despised. He believed he was a mastermind, a rogue operative taking back his destiny, securing the illicit financial independence his wife demanded. He had no idea he was nothing more than a pawn, moving exactly where I directed him to go. I closed the mirrored terminal on my tablet. I exported the forensic server logs, the time-stamped keystrokes, and the network access records into a secure, encrypted folder. I forwarded the entire dossier to Evelyn in New York with a simple one-line instruction. Draft the termination and equity forfeiture paperwork. Carter wanted to play a dangerous game of corporate espionage, armed with nothing but amateurish malice and a bruised ego. Tomorrow morning, he was going to learn what happens when you bring a stolen flash drive to a legal guillotine. The trap was locked, the evidence was pristine, and the old bloodline was about to be permanently severed from the industrial throne. Friday morning broke with a sharp, unforgiving clarity. The Michigan sky was a pale, icy blue, offering no warmth to the industrial corridors of Grand Rapids. I arrived at the main production facility of Elizabeth Machining at precisely 8 o'clock. I did not enter through the plush executive lobby. I walked directly onto the concrete expanse of the loading bay. I wore a tailored trench coat over a structured dark suit, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against the grease-stained floor. Evelyn walked beside me carrying a slender leather briefcase containing the forensic, undeniable truth. Flanking us were two private security contractors, men whose posture and silent demeanor telegraphed an authority that required no introduction. The factory was in the midst of its morning cycle. The air hummed with the heavy vibration of stamping presses and the high whine of calibration tools. I caught the eye of Thomas, my newly appointed Vice President of Operations, who was standing on the elevated catwalk. I offered him a single, subtle nod. Thomas understood. He reached out and engaged the primary kill switch for the assembly line. The roaring machinery spun down into a mechanical whine, eventually fading into an eerie, unnatural silence. The sudden quiet caused every worker on the floor to stop what they were doing. Welders lifted their visors. Machinists wiped their hands on shop towels, stepping out from behind their workstations. They gathered near the yellow safety lines, their eyes fixed on the loading dock. Carter stood near a pallet of inbound raw carbon, holding a clipboard like a prop. He looked up, his expression shifting from mild irritation to sudden, breathless panic as he registered my arrival, followed by Evelyn and the security personnel. He took a hesitant step backward, his heavy, steel-toed boots scraping awkwardly against the concrete. I did not invite him to a private office. Corporate treason committed against a working-class enterprise demanded a public execution. I closed the distance between us, stopping just a few feet away. The eyes of every man and woman on the factory floor were locked onto us. "Morning, Carter," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent facility. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above the collar of his high-visibility vest. "Audrey," he stammered, attempting to force a casual, brotherly tone. "What is all this? We have a delivery schedule to maintain. You are disrupting the supply chain." I extended my hand. Evelyn unlatched her briefcase, withdrawing a thick stack of printed server logs and digital timestamps. She handed them to me. I held the documents out, offering them to my brother. "You disrupted the supply chain last night at 9:42, I corrected him, my tone devoid of any familial warmth. "You used your supervisor credentials to access the secure engineering terminal in the logistics annex. You downloaded 32 proprietary die casting schematics onto an unregistered external drive." Carter refused to take the paper, his face drained of all color matching the gray concrete beneath our feet. "I do not know what you are talking about," he whispered, his eyes darting frantically toward the security guards. "I was conducting an inventory audit. I was checking the outbound freight manifests." Evelyn stepped forward, her presence as cold as a winter draft. "We have the encrypted keystroke logs, Mr. Elizabeth," she stated, her voice slicing through his pathetic defense. "We possess the exact metadata of the files you transferred. Furthermore, we intercepted the email correspondence you sent to our primary competitor from your unsecured personal device. We have the exact figure of the off-the-books consulting fee you negotiated in exchange for handing them our most lucrative automotive contract." A collective murmur rippled through the gathered factory workers, the men and women who relied on those contracts to feed their families, stared at Carter with raw, unfiltered disgust. They recognized him not as a fallen executive, but as a traitor, willing to trade their livelihoods for a quick payout. Carter began to shake. He looked past me, his desperate eyes searching the perimeter of the factory floor. He was looking for his father. Richard emerged from the shadows of the secondary administrative annex. He walked slowly toward the loading dock, wearing an old, faded company jacket. He had heard the machinery power down. He approached the circle we had formed, his gaze drifting from the security personnel to the stack of evidence in my hand. "Dad," Carter pleaded, his voice breaking into a high-pitched whine. "Dad, tell them they are crazy. She is making this up to get rid of me. She planted those files. You have to believe me." I turned and handed the forensic dossier to my father. Richard took the pages with trembling hands. He did not need a background in cybersecurity to understand what he was reading. He recognized the names of the engineering schematics. He read the printed emails where his own son offered to betray the legacy they had built together. The undeniable proof rested in his palms. Richard looked up from the paper. He looked at Carter. For the very first time in his life, my father saw his son with absolute, unforgiving clarity. He did not see physical grit or potential. He saw a coward, a thief, and a failure. The patriarchal illusion shattered into dust. Richard let the papers slip from his fingers. They scattered across the loading dock floor. He turned his back on Carter, unable to speak, unable to defend the boy he had chosen over me. The silence of the patriarch was the final nail in the coffin. Carter stood alone, isolated and exposed. When I drafted the new corporate bylaws, I included a very specific, very lethal stipulation. I announced, ensuring my voice reached the rafters of the facility. It is standard practice in high-level private equity. It is known as a moral turpitude clause. It dictates that any minority shareholder found committing an act of corporate espionage, embezzlement, or fraud against the primary entity will face immediate termination with cause. I took a single step closer to my brother, watching his chest heave with panicked breaths. "You are fired, Carter," I stated, delivering the sentence with clinical precision. But a simple termination is not the extent of your penalty. Per the clause you signed when you surrendered control, your criminal actions trigger an automatic equity forfeiture. The remaining minority shares you possess are hereby revoked and absorbed into the company treasury. You no longer own a single fraction of this enterprise. You have zero assets, zero income, and zero protections. He opened his mouth, grasping for air, searching for a defense that did not exist. The security contractors moved forward, flanking him on both sides. "Escort him off the property," I instructed. The guards took him by the arms, marching him down the loading ramp toward the employee parking lot. I walked to the edge of the elevated concrete dock, observing his final exit. A sleek imported sedan was idling near the gate. Vanessa was sitting behind the wheel, drumming her manicured fingers against the dashboard. She had come to drop off a forgotten lunch, or perhaps she was merely waiting for Carter to deliver news of his illicit deal. She stepped out of the vehicle as the security guards marched her husband across the asphalt. "What is going on?" Vanessa demanded, her voice shrill and piercing. "Carter, why are these men touching you? Tell them to let you go." He was terminated for corporate espionage. Evelyn called out from the dock, holding a secondary folder. He stole proprietary data to sell to a competitor. We are currently finalizing the referral to the federal prosecutor regarding the theft of trade secrets. Vanessa froze. Her performative arrogance vanished, replaced by a naked, primitive panic. She understood the implications instantly. The off-the-books money was gone. The shares were gone. Her husband was not bringing home a fortune to restore her country club status. He was bringing home a potential federal indictment. She realized that by encouraging his desperate scheme, she might be viewed as a legal accomplice. She turned on him. The veneer of their marriage dissolved right there on the wet asphalt. "You fool!" Vanessa shrieked, striking Carter on the shoulder with her expensive handbag. "You promised me you had a plan. You promised me you knew what you were doing. You ruined everything. You dragged me into this mess." Carter tried to calm her down, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender, but she shoved him away. The ensuing argument was vicious, a public display of two shallow, empty people turning on each other the moment their unearned privilege was revoked. They were screaming, pointing fingers, their voices echoing off the brick walls of the factory. I watched them implode. I felt no pity, no sadness, and no regret. I felt only a profound, icy closure. The infection had been isolated and excised from the host. "You are formally banned from these premises," I declared, ensuring my voice cut through their pathetic domestic dispute. If either of you sets foot on this property again, you will be arrested for trespassing." The security guards stood firm, ensuring they climbed into their vehicle. Vanessa slammed the door so hard the sedan shook. She sped out of the parking lot, the tires squealing against the pavement, carrying her and my brother into the oblivion they had earned. I turned away from the lot, walking back toward the center of the factory floor. The workers watched me, their expressions shifting from shock to a deep, quiet respect. I signaled Thomas. He nodded, reaching for the control panel. The heavy machinery roared back to life, the sound of progress erasing the memory of my brother. I walked toward the administrative annex. My father was sitting on a wooden bench near the time clocks, holding his old hard hat in his lap. He looked small, fragile, and incredibly old. He did not possess the booming voice or the towering presence of the man who had dismissed me at the dinner table. He looked up as I approached. "You were right, Audrey," Richard said, his voice a dry, hollow whisper. His eyes were red-rimmed, focusing on the scuffed toes of his boots. I was blinded by my own vanity. I wanted a son to inherit this place so badly that I ignored every warning sign. I let my pride nearly destroy everything my grandfather built. I treated you like a stranger because you did not fit the mold I created in my head. I am sorry." It was the first time in 32 years he had ever offered me an apology. It was the first time he had ever acknowledged my intellect over Carter's biology. I looked at the broken patriarch. I recognized the pain in his voice, the genuine remorse of a man who realized he had backed the wrong horse and lost his entire kingdom in the process. "I accept your apology, Richard," I replied softly, my tone carrying a gentle, final authority. He looked up, a faint glimmer of hope sparking in his tired eyes. He thought my forgiveness might come with a reinstatement of his power, a return of his forfeited shares, a chance to share the throne he had lost. I offered him a single polite nod. I turned away, leaving him sitting on the wooden bench. I accepted his words, but I did not return his equity. Forgiveness is an emotional transaction, but business requires a clean ledger. The toxic dynamic was permanently dismantled. The rust had been scrubbed away, leaving the structure cleansed, fortified, and ready for the future. The removal of the infection left a void, and nature despises a vacuum. I did not fill the empty executive suite with another fragile ego. I filled it with capital. Over the next 6 months, the revitalization of Elizabeth Machining became a masterclass in operational efficiency. The blue-collar workers initially treated my presence with a heavy, guarded skepticism. To the machinists and die casters who spent decades breathing metallic dust, a woman in a tailored suit descending from a Detroit penthouse represented the enemy. They had been conditioned by local media and generational folklore to view private equity directors as corporate vultures, predators who swoop in to strip the copper wire from the walls and liquidate the pensions. I did not attempt to win their affection with catered lunches or hollow motivational speeches. Respect on a factory floor is not earned through charisma. It is earned through payroll. My first official directive as the controlling owner was an immediate audit of the employee benefits ledger. Carter and Richard had quietly suspended the matching contributions to the union retirement accounts 18 months prior, labeling the theft as a temporary austerity measure. I authorized a retroactive transfer, pulling capital from the newly stabilized operating fund to replenish their accounts. When the men received their statements at the end of the month, the low grumbles of discontent vanished. They realized the paper pusher from Wall Street cared more about their financial security than the patriarch who used to drink beer with them on Fridays. With the workforce secured, I turned my attention to the antiquated infrastructure my father had worshipped. Richard believed that authentic manufacturing required human sweat and manual exertion. He viewed automation as a crutch. I viewed his philosophy as a terminal disease. I leveraged my network in Chicago, securing a specialized industrial credit facility. Within 3 weeks, a fleet of flatbed trucks arrived at our loading docks, bearing state-of-the-art computer numerical control milling centers and robotic welding appendages. The factory floor transformed. The deafening, erratic grind of outdated gearboxes was replaced by the sleek hydraulic hiss of precision robotics. We were no longer relying on human fatigue or manual guesswork. We were producing aerospace-grade components with a defect rate approaching 0. Thomas thrived in this new environment. Freed from the constraints of my father's stubborn traditionalism, he reorganized the workflow, optimizing the assembly line to accommodate the advanced machinery. The men retrained, eager to operate equipment that did not threaten to sever their fingers or collapse under thermal stress. The intersection of modern financial strategy and Rust Belt resilience created an unstoppable momentum. My father thought my career was an illusion, a series of digits on a glowing screen. He failed to comprehend that those digits were the lifeblood required to purchase the steel, upgrade the technology, and secure the future. My financial acumen provided the very foundation that allowed their physical grit to actually generate a profit. As our production metrics skyrocketed, I deployed the second phase of the restructuring. I tapped into my mergers and acquisitions Rolodex, bypassing the local automotive suppliers my brother had groveled before. I targeted international defense contractors and commercial aviation conglomerates. I flew to Washington and Seattle, carrying briefcases filled with our new flawless quality assurance reports. I negotiated supply agreements that dwarfed anything Elizabeth Machining had ever seen. The factory transitioned to running 3 full shifts, 24 hours a day, barely keeping pace with the inbound purchase orders. While the company ascended, the architects of its near ruin experienced the brutal gravity of the real world. Carter discovered that a surname carries 0 currency when stripped of its accompanying bank account. Without a college degree that held any merit, and lacking a single reference willing to vouch for his character, he was forced into the only sector that would accept him. I received a quiet update from a local associate regarding my brother's new employment. Carter was working as a shift supervisor at a sprawling, fluorescent-lit hardware superstore on the outskirts of Grand Rapids. He spent his days wearing a stiff polyester vest, wandering the aisles to help suburban homeowners locate PVC piping and discounted drill bits. His hands, once manicured and accustomed to gripping expensive golf clubs, were perpetually stained with dust from broken bags of concrete. He answered to a store manager 10 years his junior, enduring daily reprimands for his lack of hustle. The humiliation of retail labor was compounded by the swift collapse of his marriage. Vanessa possessed the loyalty of a mercenary. The moment Carter's income evaporated, her affection vanished with it. She filed for divorce less than 2 months after his termination. According to the rumors filtering through the country club circuit, the separation was remarkably bitter. Vanessa cornered him in the parking lot of the hardware store during his lunch break, dropping the legal dissolution papers directly onto the hood of his rusted commuter sedan. She drove away in a leased compact car, returning to her parents' modest home forever exiled from the elite circles she had traded her soul to join. Carter was left standing under the harsh glow of the parking lot streetlights, a deposed prince, clutching a handful of legal documents that confirmed his total isolation. My father, however, suffered a much more profound, silent punishment. Richard remained exiled in the Tudor estate, restricted by the meager allowance I permitted him to draw. He was a minority shareholder, which meant he still received the mandatory quarterly performance reports. I made certain the courier delivered them directly to his front door. Every 3 months, Richard sat in his quiet, empty study, reading the staggering figures. He saw the profit margins swell to unprecedented heights. He read the summaries of the aerospace contracts and the defense logistics agreements. He read the press clippings detailing the revitalization of the facility he nearly drove into bankruptcy. One crisp October afternoon, my driver took me past the perimeter of the industrial park. I spotted a familiar, aging luxury sedan parked across the street from the main factory gates. Richard was sitting behind the wheel, staring through the chain-link fence. He was watching the steady stream of semi-trucks rolling out of the newly expanded loading bays, carrying precision parts to global markets. I watched him through the tinted glass of my town car. The tragedy of his existence was written in the slump of his shoulders. He was forced to witness his beloved company thriving beyond his wildest, most arrogant dreams. He was forced to acknowledge the bitter, undeniable reality that the daughter he had dismissed as a paper pusher possessed the true industrial brilliance. He had spent his life searching for a male heir to carry the crown, blind to the fact that a titan was already sitting at his dining room table. The factory was no longer a struggling, nostalgic relic. It was an apex predator in the manufacturing sector, lean, highly profitable, and entirely mine. The board of directors I had installed prepared for the upcoming fiscal review. The valuation of Elizabeth Machining had multiplied exponentially, setting the stage for a strategic maneuver that would sever the past from the future permanently. A gala was approaching, an event where the old guard gathered to celebrate their stagnant legacies. I selected a dress for the occasion, preparing to deliver a final, masterful stroke that would ensure my family name was remembered exactly the way I intended. The annual Michigan Industrial Gala took place in the vaulted ballroom of the Amway Grand Plaza, a cavernous space bathed in the warm amber glow of crystal chandeliers. This was the premier event of the season for the old guard of the Rust Belt, a gathering where men who built their fortunes on auto parts and heavy machinery congratulated themselves over prime rib and top-shelf gin. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, roasted meats, and generational arrogance. I arrived just as the cocktail hour reached its peak. I chose a floor-length emerald silk gown that moved like liquid glass, paired with simple diamond studs. I did not need to wear my wealth like a shield. The entire room already knew who I was, even if some of them still refused to understand how I had conquered a century-old empire in less than a year. I ordered a glass of sparkling water and stood near the edge of the room, observing the dynamics of the crowd. It did not take long to locate my parents. Richard stood near an ornate ice sculpture, holding court with 3 rival manufacturing executives. He wore a sharp tuxedo holding a tumbler of bourbon, projecting the aura of a man still in command of his destiny. I stepped behind a marble pillar, letting the acoustics of the ballroom carry his voice toward me. We had to make some difficult choices to modernize the operation. My father told a man in a navy suit, his chest puffed out with manufactured pride. I realized our old models were holding us back. I orchestrated a structural pivot, brought in some fresh capital, and streamlined the management team. You have to be willing to trim the fat to keep the steel flowing. He took a confident sip of his bourbon. He was actually taking credit for the restructuring. He was standing in front of his peers, spinning a desperate illusion that he had engineered the very hostile takeover that stripped him of his power. He wanted them to believe he was a visionary who chose to step aside, rather than a failed patriarch who was forced out by his own daughter. I felt a brief flicker of pity, cold and fleeting, before it dissolved into sheer clinical amusement. He was clinging to the ghost of his reputation, terrified of the truth. He needed this room to view him as a kingmaker. A chime echoed through the ballroom, signaling the guests to take their seats. The cocktail hour concluded, and the formal presentations began. I walked to my reserved table near the front of the stage, taking a seat beside Evelyn and Thomas. My mother and father sat 2 tables away, strategically placed near the center aisle to maximize their visibility. The president of the Commerce Chamber took the podium, adjusting his microphone. He delivered a lengthy, predictable speech about resilience, local industry, and the enduring spirit of the manufacturing sector. And tonight, we honor a leader who embodies that spirit, the president announced, his voice echoing through the sound system. This individual stepped into a historic enterprise during a period of immense turbulence. Through sheer strategic brilliance and unyielding determination, they stabilized the workforce, modernized the infrastructure, and propelled a local institution to unprecedented heights. It is my privilege to present the Innovator of the Year Award to the controlling owner of Elizabeth Machining, Audrey Elizabeth. The applause started as a polite ripple and quickly swelled into a resounding ovation. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my gown, and walked toward the stage. The spotlight tracked my movement blindingly bright, casting long shadows across the banquet tables. I climbed the carpeted stairs and accepted the heavy crystal trophy, shaking the presenter's hand. I stepped up to the microphone. The room fell into a hushed, expectant silence. Hundreds of faces looked up at me, waiting for the standard platitudes about hard work and family values. I looked directly at my father, who was sitting rigid in his chair, wearing a tight, forced smile for the benefit of his neighbors. "Thank you," I began, my voice ringing clear and steady across the ballroom. When I took control of Elizabeth Machining, I inherited a profound responsibility. In this state, we revere the concept of grit. We romanticize the physical labor, the sweat, and the traditional hierarchies that built these factories. But raw materials and nostalgia cannot sustain a future. A legacy must evolve, or it will inevitably perish. I paused, letting the silence stretch, holding the attention of every industrial titan in the room. For the past several months, I have worked to ensure that the evolution of this company is permanent, I continued. I did not restructure the assembly lines merely to maintain our current market share. I rebuilt this enterprise to attract the attention of the global stage. I rested my hands on the edges of the wooden podium. An hour before I arrived at this venue, I signed a definitive merger agreement, I announced. The words struck the room like a physical shockwave. Elizabeth Machining has been formally acquired by Vanguard Aerospace, an international defense and aviation conglomerate. A collective gasp swept through the banquet hall. Whispers erupted at the tables. My mother brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. My father dropped his forced smile, his face twisting in sudden, uncomprehending horror. The terms of the merger value the entity at $250 million, I stated, slicing through the rising murmurs with cold, numerical precision. The whispers ceased instantly. The sheer scale of the valuation paralyzed the audience. I had taken a company drowning in $8 million of toxic debt and transformed it into a $250 million international acquisition. I was standing on that stage, a newly minted centimillionaire, having orchestrated the most lucrative private equity exit this city had seen in a decade. However, this merger is not a traditional absorption, I explained, looking down at Thomas, who was watching me with quiet reverence. Vanguard Aerospace acquired our intellectual property, our global supply contracts, and the parent holding company. They did not acquire the local workforce. As a non-negotiable condition of this sale, I mandated the creation of an employee stock ownership plan. I turned my gaze back to my father. He was gripping the edge of his table, his knuckles stark white. The physical factory, the land, and the operational equity have been transferred into a trust governed entirely by the workers, I declared. Thomas will assume the role of president. The men and women who pour the steel, who calibrate the machines, and who generate the true value of the operation now own the means of production. The facility will operate as an independent worker-owned subsidiary of Vanguard. I watched the realization crash down upon Richard. He had spent his entire life building a monument to his own surname, desperately seeking a son to inherit the throne and carry the Elizabeth title into the next century. Effective tomorrow morning, I am stepping down as Chief Executive Officer, I concluded, delivering the final, fatal blow to his patriarchal dream. I have accepted a position on the global board of directors for Vanguard Aerospace. My work here is finished. The company is secure, the workers are protected, and the future is written. I stepped back from the microphone. The room remained trapped in a stunned, breathless void for several long seconds, trying to process the magnitude of the shift. Then Thomas stood up. He began to clap. His applause echoed in the silent hall, steady and rhythmic. Slowly, the rest of the room joined him. The ovation grew deafening, washing over the stage in a tidal wave of awe and respect. I walked down the stairs carrying the Crystal Award, my posture flawless. I did not return to my reserved seat. I walked slowly down the center aisle, directly toward my parents' table. Richard sat frozen in his chair, deaf to the applause thundering around him. He stared at me, his eyes wet with a devastating, profound clarity. He finally understood the architecture of my vengeance. I had not destroyed his company. I had elevated it to a height he could never fathom, and in the process, I had permanently untethered it from our bloodline. There would be no Elizabeth dynasty. There would be no generational inheritance. He could never again walk into that factory and claim it as his own, nor could he pretend he was responsible for its triumph. His legacy was gone forever, locked away in an employee trust, stripped of his name, and handed to the very workers he used to patronize. A waiter passed by, carrying a silver tray of beverages. I reached out and lifted a slender flute of champagne. I stopped at the edge of my parents' table. My mother looked at me trembling, unable to form a single word. My father looked up, a broken, empty man, sitting in the shadow of a daughter he never took the time to know. I looked down at them, the architects of my resilience. I did not offer a speech. I did not gloat. I simply raised the glass of champagne, holding it steady in the brilliant light of the chandeliers. I offered a silent, triumphant toast to the old guard, drank the crisp wine, and turned my back on them, walking out of the ballroom as the sole, wealthy architect of my own destiny. The story of the Elizabeth family is not fundamentally a tale of private equity hostile corporate takeovers or the cold mechanics of high finance. Beneath the tailored suits and the heavy machinery, it is a profoundly American tragedy about the quiet, devastating failures of the traditional family structure. It serves as a stark mirror, reflecting the hidden fractures within homes that prioritize archaic pride over genuine connection, offering a masterclass in the psychological cost of inherited entitlement. In the tapestry of American culture, we often romanticize the multi-generational family business. We applaud the passing of the torch, viewing it as the ultimate realization of the American dream. But this narrative demands that we ask a much harder question. What happens when that torch is handed over, not based on merit, character, or competence, but on the blind vanity of gender and unearned privilege? For modern American parents, the downfall of Richard and Catherine Elizabeth delivers a brutal, necessary lesson regarding fairness and emotional awareness. When parents construct a golden child based on their own projected egos, they are not giving that child a gift. They are handing them a poisoned chalice. By shielding Carter from consequence by rewarding his failures with unearned promotions and luxury vehicles, his parents robbed him of the opportunity to develop genuine resilience. They built him a glass castle and forgot to teach him how to withstand the wind. Parenting must be grounded in the courage to see our children for who they truly are, holding them accountable so they can learn the weight of their own choices. Conversely, by marginalizing the capable child Audrey merely because she did not fit their outdated patriarchal mold, the parents severed the very lifeline that could have saved their legacy. They confused emotional suppression with loyalty, demanding she shrink herself to make her brother look taller. The essential duty of a parent is not to force a child into a pre-cut mold to preserve a family image. It is to recognize, cultivate, and honor the unique brilliance within each child. Emotional awareness requires parents to dismantle their own biases. Otherwise, they risk raising children who must either break themselves to fit in or leave the family entirely to survive. If we step back and view this societal reality through the lens of a contemplative practitioner, one focused on the inner path of self-cultivation, the destruction of the Elizabeth Empire was entirely self-inflicted. The root of all their suffering was the patriarch's unchecked ego and deep-seated ignorance. Society often teaches us to chase external monuments, the steel mills, the prestige, the country club memberships. But the contemplative view reminds us that clinging to these fleeting shadows always leads to ruin. The path to a genuinely good life requires the constant humbling refinement of the self. It demands the cultivation of 3 core pillars: clear-sighted wisdom, moral integrity, and unyielding willpower. Richard Elizabeth possessed none of these. He mistook the volume of his voice for wisdom, his blind favoritism for morality, and his stubbornness for willpower. The spiritual lesson here is inescapable. When you build your identity on the shifting sands of vanity and external validation, the universe will inevitably send a storm to wash it away. True legacy is not inherited through a surname or a factory deed. It is cultivated within. It is the wisdom to recognize truth, the integrity to act fairly, and the resilience to face reality without flinching. From the silent, calculating architect of this story, Audrey, there is a defining message for today's young people, especially those who feel overlooked, undervalued, or dismissed by the very families that were supposed to champion them. Audrey's journey whispers a cold, empowering truth. Do not wait for a crown that was never designed to fit you. If the room refuses to offer you a seat, do not waste your breath demanding their attention. Walk out into the quiet and build your own table. Your worth is not determined by the validation of an outdated patriarch or the narrow expectations of a traditional hierarchy. Your power is forged in the shadows. It is built through your own education, your own discipline, and your own quiet grit. Audrey teaches us that the ultimate response to those who underestimate you is not a shouting match. It is the flawless, undeniable ledger of your own independence. You do not need their permission to become the architect of your own destiny. We all have a choice in how we navigate the toxic dynamics we inherit, and you do not have to carry the weight of someone else's fragile ego. If you find yourself resonating with the quiet women and the overlooked children who refuse to be erased, you belong with us. Drop a comment below. Share your own story of breaking free from outdated expectations, and be sure to subscribe and follow Morning Revenge. Here, we celebrate the profound satisfaction of letting the paperwork do the talking, while the loudest voices in the room finally run out of breath. As the dust settles on the factory floor and the Elizabeth name fades from the corporate letterhead, we are left to ponder the true nature of familial duty. We are taught from birth that family loyalty means protecting our parents from their mistakes. We are told to sacrifice our own potential to keep the peace, to smile through the insults, and to preserve the fragile family picture at all costs. We assume that holding the family together is the highest moral virtue. But perhaps this is the greatest lie we pass down through the generations. Sometimes the most profound act of love and responsibility a child can perform is not to save their parents from the fire, but to hand them the match and let their illusions burn to the ground. True liberation for both the oppressor and the oppressed only begins when the archaic, decaying structures collapse, forcing everyone to finally stand naked in the cold, unforgiving light of truth. We spend our entire lives terrified of breaking the family, never realizing the ultimate terrifying reality. Some families must be broken before their members can ever truly be whole.